If you like the story, you can support the author on Patreon. Link is in the description.
Chapter 1. 289 AC, The Reach. Willis Tyrell. Don't run off too far, Willis admonished, though his tone carried little heat. His siblings only giggled back at him and scampered off deeper into the woods, the forest floor crunching loudly beneath their boots. Willis didn't begrudge their brashness. He liked seeing them being children, careless of the confining propriety and protocol of Highgarden. Near the mouth of the Mander as they were, and still in lands controlled by House Tyrell, they would be hard-pressed to find anyone dangerous enough to challenge the 2 guards walking behind him, or any game big enough to harm children this close to the village they had docked their family's pleasure barge at. He had wanted to request more men to accompany them on their little expedition, as a precaution more than anything, but with him being a near-knighted squire, he didn't want to sound unsure of his ability to protect his younger siblings. Mace Tyrell had high hopes for his son as a knight. He had pushed the squireship on Willis since he was a young boy. It wouldn't do for him to seem cowardly in front of his lord father now. Following only close enough so he could watch them, Willis ambled through the brush at a leisurely pace, carefully picking his steps on the uneven ground brimming with jutting roots and prickling briars. The wood was filled with towering oaks, elms, and leatherleaf, and the undergrowth was dense and rich with pale moon blooms, tall stalks of goldenrod and blood-red clutches of dragon's breath. It had been the flowers that convinced Marjorie and Loras to go off exploring. At his side, Garland shadowed him with a look of stiff determination on his face, as if he were another man-at-arms in their little group and not his brother. Despite being 2 years younger, he was nearly as tall as him, wider yet on the shoulders, and his once plump figure had thinned out with training. Ever since Willis was made to squire for Sir Adam Bridges, one of their family's many household knights, Garland had taken to following his older brother like he was Willis' own squire, and even now he walked with a hand tucked on his belt just as Willis did on the hilt of his sword, though the boy was not yet allowed to carry live steel at only 1 and 10. The sun was still low in the east, but the cloudless sky promised heat and sweat throughout the rest of the day. Willis had enough lessons on the importance of forethought and planning from his grandmother, even in the simple things, so he took off his dark green velvet coat and wrapped the sleeves about his waist. It left only a white doublet emblazoned with the blooming flower of his house to cover his chest. A faint breeze was gusting through the trees from the north, the air carried the strong smell of wild flowers and wet earth. The smell of summer. They walked in silence after Marjorie and Loras for several more minutes before he heard a cracking sound somewhere off in the distance. He paused when he heard it again only a few moments later. "What's that?" he asked, suddenly growing nervous. The sound echoed through the forest again. "Someone splitting logs nearby is all, Lord," Ben said behind him. Lorne seemed to agree, giving him a grunt and a nod. Willis took a moment to realize what that meant and nodded to the guards. He turned about until he caught sight of his siblings off to his right, frolicking near a patch of black elderberry flowers. They laughed as they blew on the petals and set them to float in the air around them. "Marjorie! Loras!" he called with his lordly voice. "Come here!" Pouting, the youngest Tyrells shuffled their feet until they stood before him. Loras' own velvet coat was creased and fraying at the sleeves, and Marjorie's bright yellow dress was caked with mud near the hemline. Willis could only imagine their grandmother's incoming admonishment. "Do we have to leave already?" Loras whined. "No, not yet," he said. He turned to where the sound of cracking wood was coming from and put a hand on Loras' shoulder, steering him in the right direction. "We're going on a little adventure." "Come. Truly?" Marjorie asked, her golden brown eyes wide and innocent. "Truly, dear sister," he said. She held out a small hand, and he took it on his own before setting off. He looked back at Garland and the 2 guards following him and said, "Mind yourselves now." Soon, the crack of metal on wood grew louder and clearer. As they drew nearer, the dense undergrowth thinned around them, until the canopy above finally opened up to clear blue sky. Beyond, a young man only a few years older than him stood over a tree stump not a stone's throw away from them, a woodsman axe in his hands and a pile of split logs beside him. Focused on his task as he was, the young woodsman placed another piece of firewood on the flat of the stump without noticing them, raised his axe high above his head, and swung down. The log split in half cleanly, and the axe bit into the stump with a resounding thunk. Loras drew a sharp breath, and the young man finally looked up from his work. At first glance, Willis had to admit the man was striking black-haired, tall, sharp, and slender as a sword, and, most surprising, he had the violet eyes of old Valeria. He wore a simple workman's shirt, the sleeves rolled up to his elbows, with an open leather jerkin on top and rough spun brown pants. The young man gazed at the men-at-arms escorting them with suspicion, though his eyes softened when passing over Willis' young siblings. Behind him, the guardsman had tensed, hands reaching swords, until he raised a hand to stop them. Willis cleared his throat. "Forgive us the interruption, good man," he said. "My name is Willis of House Tyrell, son of Mace Tyrell, Lord of Highgarden. These are my younger brothers and sister, Garland, Loras, and Marjorie." He pointed to each of them in turn. "We were passing by when we heard you." Before the man could respond, Marjorie stepped forward and excitedly asked, "Is that your home?" Willis followed her gaze to the far end of the clearing, where a sturdy-looking house built with thick logs for walls and a thatched roof stood above a low hill, surrounded by a field of short, emerald-colored grass. Two smaller outhouses leaned against the log house, with pigs and chickens inside them. The man smiled gently at Marjorie. "Indeed, that is where I live, my lady," he said, looking back at the house with fondness. His voice was deep and smooth, cultured in a way Willis had never heard coming from peasants. The man turned back to them and bowed, an act he seemed equally practiced in, though stiff with disuse. "An honor to make your acquaintances, my lords. My name is Galad of, well, here. But you may call me Galad." An odd name, Willis thought. "SSC, perhaps?" Keeping the question from showing on his face, Willis simply nodded. "The honor is ours, Galad. And forgive my sister, she's always been too curious for her own good." Marjorie glowered sullenly at him, but Galad only waved a hand. "It is no trouble, my lord. Inquisitiveness in the young is a virtue, not a sin." Willis smiled despite himself. His father would have named it intrusiveness instead and called it uncouth and boorish behavior on top, especially for a lady, but Willis found himself agreeing nonetheless. "Would you like to try?" Galad suddenly asked, and the question was not for him. To his side, Loras just bobbed his head up and down as if in a trance. The man chuckled, and even Garland cracked a smile. "Come on, then. I'll teach you how." For a second, he turned his eyes to Willis, as if to seek permission. Inclining his head, Willis relinquished his hold on Loras' shoulder. The boy bounded out the tree line at once, skidding to a stop next to the violet-eyed woodsman. And for the next few minutes, Galad taught Loras everything he needed to know until he could split a log by himself, from where to grip the haft, how to breathe at the right moments, where to hit the wood. Willis had hardly seen such a patient teacher, even when Loras got ahead of himself several times in his boundless energy. As the minutes and logs ticked by, Willis allowed himself to relax, sitting back against the tree to watch the two of them. Garland followed soon after, taking the next tree over. Besides their guards, Marjorie was the only one still standing, staring at the pair splitting the logs with longing. As if feeling her eyes on him, Galad glanced up from his work. "Do you want to try as well?" he asked. The girl nodded shyly, but didn't move forward. It was obvious she wanted to, but all sense of propriety told otherwise. After a moment's hesitation, Willis said, "Go on, Marjorie. Just this once." Her eyes widened in surprise, then the biggest smile bloomed on her face. She lunged at him, gave him a tight hug, and dashed back toward Galad and Loras. "Willis?" Garland asked, a hint of uncertainty in his voice. "It's fine," he said. "Let her have this. She's already a proper lady everywhere else, even at her age." Garland nodded, and they kept silent as their brother and sister worked on the pile under Galad's supervision. XXX. Willis had nearly dozed off when the final log had been split, his siblings' excited cheers pulling him out of his daydreams. Chuckling at their antics, he pushed off the tree and walked up to them, Garland just a step behind him. Both of the kids were caked with sweat, chips of wood sticking to their clothes. But the big smile on their faces made it worth it. "Are you all done, then?" he asked. Loras quickly darted to his side. "Did you see it, Willis?" he asked, pulling at his sleeves. "I was like HA. And the log went clack. That last one was perfect." Willis laughed. "I did, yes. As great a swing as I've seen." He mussed up his brother's hair, then turned to his sister. "And you, little lady, don't think I didn't see the way you were holding up that axe like a proper ironborn." Marjorie had been jumping up and down on the balls of her feet a moment ago, but now she was back to her demure smiles. "Master Galad had to help me holding it up," she said, "but I did do it." The ladylike expression was broken by the tangles in her hair and the flush on her cheeks. Willis could only smile. It was good seeing her acting like a child. As the two of them started relaying their war stories to Garland, he turned his eyes to the woodsman. "Thank you for this," he said, perfectly sincere. It meant a lot to them. Galad nodded, wiping sweat off his brow. "No problem at all, my lord. They are good children." He looked up at the glaring sun for a moment before turning back to him. "It is getting rather hot outside, and I have clearly forgotten my manners. Would you like to come inside for some refreshments? I'll carry the logs back later." "Yes!" Marjorie cried, suddenly right behind him, followed by Loras turning to him, eyes pleading. "Can we, Willis? Can we please?" Willis couldn't find it in himself to refuse those eyes. He should have known better than to name whatever this was as an adventure. "I don't see why not," he said. "Lead the way, Master Galad." The walk up the small hill was done with Loras and Marjorie piling the young woodsman with inane questions about his life, from what he ate and drank, to the animals he raised and the kinds of people in the village he was friendly with. The kids seemed fascinated by it all. Galad answered them dexterously and amiably, and Willis had to admit he also found himself curious. Despite visiting a few of the orphanages and mother houses that Highgarden sponsored, he had never been inside the home of a small folk. Willis doubted his family would approve, but he found himself curious as to how they lived. He was to be their future lord, shouldn't he know more about his subjects? The inside of the cabin was better than what Willis imagined. It didn't stink, nor did it look particularly bedraggled. He quietly admonished himself for that. These are people, not pigs. Of course they would keep their own homes tidy. The house was brightly lit by several windows with their shutters open. A large stone fireplace occupied one side of the main room, with 2 cushioned chairs and a bench arrayed around it, while a broad table dominated the other. Cabinets and trunks lined the walls, neatly stacked and cleaned, and Willis even saw a small pile of wood-bound books tucked against a bundle of furs. Tall, sturdy chairs sat around the table, and to the side, a closed door led to a smaller room. Galad's bedroom, most likely. Their host had them seated with drinks in hand before long, fresh milk for the children and cider from a small cask for himself, Garland, and Willis. He even invited Ben and Lorne to sit at his table, though the two kept to their duties standing. They didn't pass on the cider, however, drinking from 2 horns Galad provided. One of the windows opened to the back of the house, and Willis spotted another building he hadn't seen from their approach. A modest wooden barn, only large enough for a couple of animals. Tucked to its side was a garden of sorts, and though Willis' preferences lay mostly in martial pursuits, he knew from Highgarden's own plentiful terraces that there were rows of cabbage, beet, peas, and onion there. "Do you plant them yourself?" Marjorie asked. She had been staring out too, eyes wide with wonder. Loras craned his head around to check with her. Galad chuckled. "Indeed, my lady. I plant, raise, and hunt what I can. What I cannot, I trade for in the village. You're allowed to hunt around here." That was Garland, genuine in his curiosity. Willis answered him, "Dustinbury sits empty for now, and our Lord Father has allowed for hunters to use the woods around a few of the villages to their heart's content." For all his faults, Mace Tyrell was not an unkind lord. The Reach had flourished under his rule, and so had its people. Although, in truth, most of those accolades could be put at the feet of Willis' grandmother. Galad nodded. "That he has," he said. "These woods are teeming with good game. Plenty of white-tailed deer, elk, and wild boars. And some small game too." "You are good with a bow, then?" Garland asked, leaning forward on his seat. Much like him, Garland was fascinated by anything related to knighthood. The boy was already better than many a squire older than him, and Willis knew that in another few years it would be him his brother would surpass. Galad didn't answer right away. He took his time sipping at his drink, and for a moment there he looked almost forlorn, lips pursed, eyes distant. "I had great teachers," he finally said, breaking the silence. Suddenly realizing his own mood, Galad cleared his throat and gave Garland a small smile. "You must be good with the bow to live as a hunter, my lord. It is a simple life, yes, but a good one. I have come to appreciate it." Before Willis could ask how he had come to appreciate being a hunter if he had always been one, there were loud, shouting voices outside. At first he thought it was his father's men come looking for them, a misunderstanding he could easily settle with a few calm words. Then Galad was suddenly on his feet, his violet eyes devoid of any of the warmth of the previous hour. Willis followed him up, ready to step outside and reassure the men of their safety. He didn't want Galad getting into trouble for something as foolish as this. To the side, Lorne had moved to one of the windows, and what he saw outside made his mustached face grow pale. "Ironborn," he whispered. Willis' stomach dropped at those words. No, surely not, he thought with growing dread. Surely Lorne was mistaken. The Ironborn hadn't raided for years, and they would have heard news from the Shield Islands before any such attack could happen. But then he glanced at the same window his guard was looking out of and caught his first glimpse of the men outside. They emerged from the tree line in a mad sprint, armed with swords and axes and mauls, war cries on their lips. On one of the Iron Man's tabard, a sigil stood out beyond all others. A golden kraken, rampant in a field of black. Willis' breath caught in his throat, terror mounting in his heart. This wasn't a raid, he realized. They wouldn't wear their lord's sigil if it was. This was rebellion. Chapter 2. Willis Tyrell. Galad was the first one to snap out of it. Up! Bar the windows and the door. As if commanded by the king himself, Ben and Lorne jerked into motion. Ben rushed past Willis toward Lorne, his jaw set with resolve. Uncaring of the half-full cups on top, the two guards picked up the thick wooden table and overturned it in front of the back door. The chairs and trunks followed. Willis stood stock still, frozen with indecision. "How many of them are there?" Garland asked, voice shaken. Beside him, Loras and Marjorie hugged each other for comfort, his little brother trying to soothe his sister despite the fear evident in his face. It was the very definition of love, and the men outside wanted to destroy it. Butcher it. That's what broke through his own fears, imagining what would happen to his siblings if he didn't act. If he didn't step up as the future Lord of Highgarden. Steeling himself, Willis rushed to the windows, pulling the wooden shutters together and latching them closed. It wouldn't hold against even a single blow of an Ironborn's axe, but sometimes the mere illusion of cover could serve as a deterrent. "I counted 11, m'lord," Ben said as he stacked furniture by the back door. "House is solid enough. We can hold 'em off at the front door till someone comes to help." "No," Galad said, heading into his bedroom. "They'll just torch the place with us inside. It comes down to a fight." "Fuck," Ben muttered. "Not great odds." Willis would have admonished the curses in front of his younger siblings if the situation wasn't as desperate as it was. Lorne seemed to agree with Galad. With all the available furniture pushed against the back door, the often silent guard simply pulled his sword out of its scabbard and turned to him. "Orders, m'lord." Ben too turned to him, as did Garland and his siblings. They all looked to him as if he had all the answers in the world. Willis opened his mouth to speak, but found he couldn't form the words. His mouth felt dry as dust. All the training in the world hadn't prepared him for this. As if summoned by his need, Galad appeared from his bedroom, a sheathed long sword in his hands. "We'll do as the Lord said." He nodded toward Ben. "Hold them at the door for a moment. They'll try to set the house alight when they get frustrated, but it shall not come to that." Before anyone could answer, there was a loud bang at the back door. Loras and Marjorie jumped at the sound. Another crack followed, a similar noise to when Galad was chopping wood. The Ironborn had arrived. Ben and Lorne needed no other incentive. They rushed to the front door, the older and more experienced man-at-arms, Lorne, taking the lead. His weathered face held a look of grim determination. He was ready to die for his charges, Willis knew. "What will you do?" Garland asked, looking toward Galad. Pounding footsteps crossed the outside of the house. Loud, coarse voices could be heard through the windows too, yelling at each other, hurling insults at those inside, taunting and teasing. Marjorie let out a whimper when the head of an axe bit through a shutter. The sword in Galad's hands came singing out of its sheath. "I'll end this," he said, then turned to leave. His words held a tone of finality to it. A certainty Willis always thought reserved for veteran knights or experienced artisans, both confident in the mastery of their craft. Not a young man like Galad. The kind of words that inspired him to be better. Swallowing down the knot in his throat, Willis stepped up. "Then I will help you." "No." Willis froze at the sudden bark. Or was it that a small folk had talked to the son of a high lord in such a manner? Galad turned to regard him, a troubled look on his face. That is not a good idea, my lord." His violet eyes were dark under furrowed brows. "Please, stay here and protect your siblings if the worst comes." Then he was swiftly gone, slipping past a small side door hidden behind a curtain in the eastern wall of the house. And for the second time in the day, Willis stood stumped in the middle of a tiny, small folk house. Behind him, Garland knelt while whispering comforting words to Marjorie and Loras. The sounds of battle started a moment later. Steel batting against steel, ring mail chinking as men moved in their armor. The Ironborn screams met Ben's own war cry, echoing inside the house, though they couldn't see the front door from the main room. Marjorie started to cry, sobbing against Loras' shoulder. Willis could barely look at them. He didn't know what to say again. They all looked up to him, and he'd failed them. He sought comfort on the sword at his side, and his hand held firm to the hilt. He didn't know what to say, but he'd die fighting for his siblings. That, at least, he could do. XXX. Galad. By the time the hidden door closed behind him, Galad had achieved the oneness. All his doubts and insecurities, all his fears that had fountained inside him when he spotted those men, were fed into the flames in the void of his mind. He wouldn't be able to fight at his best if he let himself be consumed by the ghosts of his past. Of his failures. If he wanted to save those children, those who depended on him, then he couldn't think of them in the middle of combat. In the oneness, none of that mattered. He was one with the sword in his hand, one with the sparrows in flight above his house, one with the Ironborn man a few feet in front of him, who had turned at the sound of the door. He could perfectly hear the man's breathing, the clink of his mail armor. If he focused, he would hear the man's heart beating inside his chest, the blood pumping furiously as the Ironborn prepared himself for a fight. Galad wouldn't need such a focus against this foe. Beneath his half-helm, the man's grizzled face contorted into an ugly scowl before he rushed at him in a mad dash, axe and shield propped in each hand, and Galad knew him to be a fool. A man who fought in a rage died in a rage. Galad didn't move. Not until the Ironborn was upon him, axe raised high for a powerful downward swing. Then he stepped to the side, feet sliding gracefully across the grass. The axe cleaved only air, but Galad's sword didn't miss. It flashed up and across, a single movement, and the head of the Iron Man fell to the ground. Beyond a flick of the wrist to clean his blade of blood, he didn't stop to admire his handiwork. He could hear the fighting going on the other side of the house by the front door as if it was happening right in front of him. Curses flying as sure as swords, castle-forged steel ringing against reavers' blades, heavy grunts of exertion. There was no time for consideration. Galad moved across the lawn as quickly and silently as he could, face devoid of emotion. He took the corner and came upon the north side of the house just in time to watch one of the Tyrell guards being cut in the leg and bashed in the chest. The young man-at-arms fell backward into the house, and the Ironborn surrounding the entrance roared in cheer. The last Tyrell guard stepped up to cover the bottleneck of the front door by himself. Brave as it was, Galad knew he wouldn't last long against so many of them. Two of the Ironmen already lay dead on the ground, but in their minds, there was only one guard left before they could get to the children inside. Despite their roar, Galad did not give a cry of his own. He approached them from the side, silent as a ghost, and the first two Ironborn fell before they knew death was upon them. A third one turned in time to lift his shield up, but Galad twisted his sword at the last moment and slashed him across the thigh. The blade bit deep into flesh, and the reaver let out a cry as he fell to his knees, wound gushing with blood. The other Ironborn finally turned toward him, and in the stunned moment it took for them to realize they'd been flanked, Galad could finally take the time to look at them. There were 5 left, though 2 fought against the Tyrell guard blocking the doorway, and the 3 men in front of him weren't green boys by any means. Grey-peppered beards and hair, their arms and armor looked used but of good quality, and they all had the leathery, weather-worn face of lifelong sailors. Galad frowned. Living a simple life in the backwaters of the kingdom, he did not have all the historical and political knowledge to fully understand what such a raid meant. Here, he hadn't grown up in palaces with tutors and teachers of history and warfare and every subject men had taken to write books on, like he once had. But he did not need to be a lord or a maester of the citadel to know what this meant either. By the looks of the reavers, this was no hot-headed young captain so eager for plunder that he'd gotten carried away and had sailed his crew up the Mander into the rich lands of the Reach. This was a serious raid, conducted by an experienced crew. His resolve firmed. Galad would not let those children be used as hostages, or worse, by these barbarians. Leave now, he warned, or die far from the halls of your drowned god. Even to himself, Galad's voice sounded cold in the oneness. One of the Ironborn, a tall man with arms like trunks standing farthest to the right, hawked a glob of phlegm and spat on the grass. I'll gut ya like a trout, pretty boy. He had a large, double-headed axe in both hands, and he pointed it menacingly at Galad as he spoke. The other two ironborn, these holding long swords and shields, gained heart at that, roaring their assent, and the three men advanced on him. So be it, Galad whispered, holding his own blade out in front of him. Despite their bravado, however, they had seen the trail of bodies Galad had left in his wake, and they were no fools when it came to combat. They spread out in a half-moon around him, and when they struck together. One of the swordsmen stabbed high while the other sliced at Galad's legs. At the same time, the tall axe-wielder tried to hack him in two as if he were a tree to be felled. It didn't matter. Galad hadn't fought in a real battle since his death in his previous world, and hadn't done much beyond practicing the forms by himself since his caretaker died, but his instincts had not dulled. To Galad, they might as well be moving underwater. Feigning a thrust to force a defensive reaction from the tall ironborn, he pivoted the other way at the last moment, dancing around the stab and parrying the slice. The stabber's eyes went wide as he overextended, and Galad took his arm off at the elbow just below where his ring mail shirt ended. The man hadn't begun screaming yet before Galad moved again. Putting the swordsman in between himself and the taller ironborn, he pressed the attack, blade a whirlwind of thrusts and slices. The swords rang keenly as they met in the middle, once, twice, then Galad was past the man's guard. In the time it took for the taller one to flank him, he scored 3 deep cuts along the swordsman's thighs and forearms. The man's grip on his sword slackened as thick arterial blood flooded the sleeve of his gambeson. He was done for, Galad knew. He turned to meet the tall reaver, but the man had stopped as he watched his last companion fall. A flicker of uncertainty marred his coarse features. Ironborn were said to be fearless in battle, but Galad's promise must have weighed heavily on the man. Were he to die here on land, he would not go on to meet his god. "Who the fuck are yet?" he asked, fingers opening and closing nervously around the heft of his large axe. The question gave him pause. Galad didn't know the answer himself. Once, he was the Lord Captain Commander of the Children of Light. The first Prince of the Sword of Camlin. Brother to a queen and husband to another. Now, he wasn't so sure. In the end, Galad simply answered with the truth. "To you, death." Chapter 3. Willis Tyrell. His hand did not leave the pommel of his sword when the sound of fighting stopped. Willis couldn't tell who had won the battle, and the deafening silence only made it worse. With Lorne and Ben fighting at the door, every clang of steel had rang like thunder inside the house. It made his bones rattle, but at least then he had known for certain they were not yet doomed. Marjorie had not stopped sobbing in Laura's arms the whole time, and though he tried to put on a brave face, Willis could see the tears in the boy's eyes too. Only Garland had remained steadfast, comforting his siblings with sweet words as best as he could. Yet every once in a while he would glance toward the end of the house where the fighting would be, flinty resolve darkening his usually warm eyes. Gods forbid the Ironborn were to make it through, Willis knew he would not fight alone, even if he protested. Garland the gallant indeed. He should have named him Garland the brave instead. Braver than he, to be sure. Even though he stood still as the wall in front of his siblings, his heart did not stop hammering inside his chest until Ben hobbled into the room. The guard was clearly in pain, and he was using his sheathed sword as a crutch to help him move. "It's done, Lord," he said with a thin smile. Willis almost fell to his knees. Only his grandmother's training allowed him to swallow down the storm of feelings churning inside him and nod to the guard. He needed to be seen as being in command in front of their house's men, always. Turning to his siblings, Willis gave them the best smile he could muster. "We're safe now," he told them. "We're safe." With a cry, Marjorie and Loras launched themselves toward him, hugging his waist and burying their faces on his shirt as if he'd been the one to save them instead of the guards. Behind them, Garland let out a trembling sigh. Brave or not, his brother was still a boy. "Now, stay with Garland for a moment," Willis said gently. Marjorie looked up at him with red-rimmed eyes ready to protest, but he placed a hand on her head. "Fret not, I'll be back in a second, yes." Marjorie acquiesced and pulled Loras along. Gathering the children up in a hug, Garland nodded at him over their heads. He understood Willis had a duty. Taking a final breath to center himself, Willis strode out of the living room. Ben had limped back toward the front door while he was seeing to his siblings, and he understood why as soon as he turned the corner. Ben was slumped down against the wall, his clean-shaven face paler than usual. It was hard to tell against all the blood splattered on his front, but Willis thought he could see a large gash on the man's left thigh. He swallowed. The guard had taken the wound defending them. Lorne hovered over Ben. The older guard seemed hale, if slightly out of breath. It's bad, Lorne grunted, inspecting the wound. Truly? I hadn't noticed. Ben chuckled darkly. Seems this is it for me, eh? Good way to die, though. Taking some iron-born scum down. He let out a weak laugh again which soon turned into a hacking cough. Willis opened his mouth to speak, to comfort the man, or thank him for giving his life for theirs. The sound of footsteps outside stopped him. The dying Ben had taken all his attention, and for the first time, Willis turned to look out the door. He wished he hadn't as soon as he did. Bodies littered the grass in front of the house, almost 10 of them, though it was hard counting. Some were without arms or legs. Others without heads. A few limbs seemed to have fallen far from their previous owners. The smell of it all hit him then. It wasn't the rotting stench he'd been expecting either. That would come later. It was blood and piss and shit, all mixed together, wafting up his nose like thick sludge. Bile rose in his throat. And in the middle of the carnage, Galad walked unbothered past the bodies and up the steps of the front door. A craftsman going about his craft. His sword was still out, hanging by his side as clean as if it just left its sheath. Lorne stiffened as Galad came inside. The old guard took a protective step in front of Willis, which only served to confuse him more. What in the seven hells had happened outside? Why was Galad's sword unbesmirched? Had he not helped them? The woodsman himself didn't seem to even notice the guard. Putting the sword back into its scabbard at his side, he walked past the two of them toward the small kitchen area inside the house. Plants and herbs in clay pots hung from the ceiling there, and Galad picked a few leaves from one of the pots, then a floriade from another, and put them all inside a hardwood mortar. A good way to die, yes, Galad said, shifting now to rummage through a drawer. He picked out what looked to be a clean bolt of cloth and a sewing kit. But you're not dead yet. A fucking maester too now, are you? Lorne growled. Galad shrugged, already mixing the ingredients. Accidents happen when you wield an axe every day, and out here a man must make do without maesters. Lorne's eyes narrowed. Never met no woodsman could cut men down like that. Who are you? His hand came to hover over his sword. The truth now. Willis felt lost in the middle of the exchange. Lorne was a veteran amongst his father's swords. He'd grown up watching the large man training in the yard, patrolling the halls of Highgarden. Always serious. Always silent. He'd never seen the man string more than 2 words together. What could Galad have done to disturb him so? I'm the man who can save your friend's life, sire. When Galad turned, he had his hands full with the mortar, the cloth, and the sewing kit. Will you let me? Lorne seemed taken aback by the answer. Uncertainty flickered over his weathered face. Veteran or not, he wasn't a man used to making decisions. His eyes shot toward Willis. This time, Willis didn't hesitate. Go ahead, Master Galad, he said. Ben fought valiantly for the safety of myself and my siblings. If you can slow the bleeding, we'll take him back to the barge. My grandmother doesn't go anywhere without a maester on hand. XX. The man that raised me was a knight, Galad explained as they trudged through the forest. Behind them, Garland held the leads of a stocky mule and a piebald destrier, the animals pulling the cart carrying an injured Ben and their 2 younger siblings. Marjorie had insisted she hold Ben's hand as they traveled back toward their family's barge. Willis was proud of her for that. He fought in the rebellions, Galad continued. Both Roberts and Maylis. He taught me what he knew until he passed the year before last. I see, Willis said. Know that you'll be well rewarded for your service to House Tyrell today. The woodsman nodded, seeming neither enthused nor dissatisfied at the thought of future compensation. That was another oddity to add to the mystery that was Galad. Most small folk would be elated at the mere possibility of being rewarded by their lords. Though his knightly upbringing did explain his skills with the sword, Willis still felt like that could not be the full story. Perhaps it was the way Galad held himself. His choice of words and mannerisms. He was not blind to his guardsman's suspicions on Galad either. He'd ordered Lorne to scout ahead in the forest, and the man had balked at leaving them alone with the woodsman. A well-meaning thought, but clearly unnecessary in Willis' mind. Had Galad wanted to hurt them, he could have done so at many opportunities. In the end, Willis did tell Lorne to stay within shouting distance, both to assuage the guardsmen and because it was tactically sound in their current situation. They were taking a longer, less traveled path toward the village where the barge had anchored. After Willis gave voice to his fears of an outright Ironborn rebellion, Galad had advised a more cautious approach in their return, and he agreed. Surviving the last Ironborn attack would do no good if they faced another on the way. Master Galad, Garland raised his voice behind them. Have the Ironborn raided this area before? Not in generations, I don't think, Galad said. I've heard of raids further down the mouth of the Mander near the sea, but one would be hard-pressed to tell between tale and truth. Willis raised his voice. Father has not had word of raids anywhere south of the Shield Islands in years, he said. There have been attacks by Old Oaken on fishing villages up the ocean road, but when they happen, there are not many survivors to tell the tales, and the reavers avoid flying the flags of their lords. Everyone knows it's the Ironborn, but the Reach cannot take empty concerns to the Iron Throne. Was this the first time you killed, then? Garland asked, his voice shaky. The Master-at-Arms at Highgarden has told me about it before. About how it would feel. About how it could affect a man. Galad did not answer at once. Willis watched as the man's face remained placid beside a slight tightening of the brow. After a long moment, Galad let out a small exhale. Yes, he said solemnly. In its own way, this was the first time I killed. Despite his calm demeanor, Willis could see that what Galad had done, and that in defense of himself and his siblings, was eating at him inside. His mouth suddenly felt dry. As a hunter, Galad was undoubtedly quite used to killing game for a living. Willis himself had gone on many a hunt with his lord father, and he remembered vividly the first time he was made to finish off a rabbit one of their men had caught. At only 8 years old, he had nightmares of the animal's thin shriek for weeks afterward. But he had never killed a man. Never looked one in the eye and saw the light leave his eyes. Never had to think about tearing a man away from his family. How long would those nightmares last? It would be the height of impropriety for Willis to comfort the woodsman, nor did he think Galad was the kind of man who would wish to be indulged in this manner, so he simply gave him a nod. The time for rewards would come yet. Once they were back with Willis' family, all would be resolved. Garland had no answer to that either, his face twisted into a conflicted look. Their party fell silent then. Beyond the sounds of the forest, of insects chattering underfoot, birds singing on the canopies, only the groan of the cart could be heard, the rickety wheels struggling through the uneven terrain, more a hunter's path than a road. Until Galad pointed into the distance. Willis' eyes followed his finger. 2 columns of dark smoke rose up above the trees, marring the clear blue sky like black scars. A third curled up beside them as they watched. The village, Galad said, voice grim. We were not the only ones attacked. Garland's eyes widened in realization, and a strangled sob escaped Marjorie on the cart. While she held Ben's hand with one of her own, Loras had his fingers interlaced with her other hand. Tears shone in the corner of the boy's eyes, but he did not cry. Their entire family had stopped at the village inn, bringing their cooks and servants to prepare a meal worthy of the Lords of the Reach. Now, he didn't even know if they were still alive. Swallowing down the knot caught in his throat, he turned to his siblings. Our family has more than 20 guards with them, he said soothingly. Somehow, his voice didn't crack as he spoke. The Ironborn might have set a few buildings on fire, but the brave men of Highgarden will have fought them off by now. Garland gave a fierce nod. They are safe, he said. They must be. Despite wanting to believe his brothers and his own words, he could not help but feel dread at the prospect of what they would find in the village. They walked a few more minutes in tense silence before Lorne returned. His mustached face, lips in a thin line and brows twisted into a heavy frown told its own story. Willis' stomach churned. Leaving Garland with the children, they moved a few feet away to speak with the guardsmen where they wouldn't be overheard. It's bad, my lord, he said once Willis questioned him. The barge is afire with half the village. Many dead in the street. The fighting's thick by the inn and the building beside it, but there's more of them than us. Something clenched in his chest at those words, like a cold fist closing around his heart. He looked back at his siblings, at their innocent faces, their eyes glancing at him with mingling fear and hope. His family had not left Highgarden prepared for war today, but war had found them nonetheless. Willis let out an exhale to settle himself. He had to be strong. For his siblings, for his parents and grandmother who needed him now. For the Reach as a whole. A future Lord Tyrell could not falter. We must relieve them, he said, looking between Lorne and Galad. Between the 3 of us, we can make a difference if we strike them from behind, surprise them swiftly and decisively. What of your siblings, my lord? Galad asked. Willis gave him a short look. You expect children to fight? No, but someone must stay with them, he clarified. There might be stray reavers roaming these woods. It would be unwise to leave them behind now. Willis acknowledged the point with a nod. Of course the man didn't mean for little Loras and Marjorie to fight. He was getting frazzled. He found his hands were shaking with the knowledge of what he had to do now. To fight. To kill. And mayhaps, to die. You are right, of course, Willis said, trying to keep his restlessness in check. You have done much for my family already, Master Galad, but I will ask another favor of you still. Despite my best hopes, I do not know if we will win the day here. And I must secure my siblings before anything else. I beg that you take them under your protection and head toward Highgarden. The guards will open the gates for you when they recognize them. Once there, speak to Sir Vortimer Craner about what happened here and bid him send help. Perhaps they will make it in time. This time, he did not believe his own words at all. Even if they left the cart with Ben behind and mounted the horse and mule, it would be hours until they made it back to Highgarden, and hours more for reinforcements to arrive. But it was better that his siblings, especially Garland, believed the lie. It would make them more willing to go. Instead of the answer he expected, Galad shook his head. That is folly, my lord. You have not the strength of arms to make a difference here. You must be the one to take your siblings with you. I will stay with your man here and relieve the village. Go now, and quickly. We can tarry no longer. Willis didn't know if it was Galad's brazenness which set him off, or his own nerves at the entire situation, but he felt a surge of burning anger rise within him. I need not suffer insults from you, woodsman. I am Lord Mace Tyrell's son, heir to Highgarden and all the Reach. His cheeks flushed with heat. How dare this lowborn no one speak to him in this manner? This is my duty, not yours. There will be honor and glory in facing my enemies in battle. I will not shame myself by running and hiding with the children while my family bleeds. I will not be thought of as a craven rat. His voice nearly broke as he finished, the fear beneath the fury becoming all the more obvious. Despite the chastisement, Galad's expression did not change. He only looked at him, head slightly tilted, and Willis deflated. He suddenly felt small under those haunting purple eyes. His gaze dropped. Hot shame flooded him. It was not the way a lord should feel. Not the way his father would want his heir to feel. Willis shook his head, fists opening and closing at his side. He was breathing hard. His lungs felt like they were burning up. He needed to be stronger than this, needed to be in control of himself, needed to bury his fears deeply where none could see, needed to. A rough hand settled over his shoulder. He looked up again in surprise and found the woodsman was still staring at him. Only the purple eyes had softened now. A warrior must know when to stay his blade, even more so than when to wield it, Galad told him. This is one such time, my lord. There's no shame in that. Those are grown men out there, veterans of 100 raids by the looks of it. I imagine you're used to sparring in a cobbled courtyard, where the ground is even and steady, with armor and padding and the lot. What good will your death do but bereave your family of their heir? This is not your fight. Not yet. Leave now and protect your siblings. There's more honor in that than in 1,000 glorious, pointless deaths. Willis felt his eyes widen the more the man spoke. He didn't know what to answer. Lorne grunted beside him. Woodsman's right, my lord, he said, then spat to the side. Hate to say it. He gave a shallow nod at that. Galad was right. Of course he was. Willis felt like a foolish child being confronted with the cruel reality of the world. How could he, a squire of no great skill dressed in silk and velvet, make any kind of difference against dozens of well-armed and armoured iron-born reavers? It took another heartbeat for him to find his voice. I see, he said. Then, so be it. We will do as you say, Master Galad. Chapter 4. Galad did not kill the first man with his sword. The muscles in his back flexed as he drew, the bow bending smoothly beneath his hand. He did not pause to measure his breath or count a heartbeat. Deep in the oneness, his body knew what to do without thought intruding. He loosed. The arrow hissed through the air and took the iron-born in the throat. The man had been hacking at the flower hearth's heavy oak door with a broad-bladed axe, each strike ringing loud enough to carry over the din of battle. The sound cut off mid-swing. He dropped bonelessly, axe slipping from his fingers as dark blood sprayed across the stone threshold. Galad didn't blink. He only breathed out, slow and controlled as always, and his hand was already reaching for another arrow. The void was complete now. The world narrowed to angles, distances, motion. He felt the contraction of each muscle as he set his stance again, the faint vibration of the bowstring as he drew it back to his cheek. The longbow was familiar in his hands. A hunting bow, not a soldier's weapon, but it might as well have been a part of his body. For most of his past life, he was never one for archery. The path of the blade a more honorable and noble endeavor then. But those last years when the war turned against the Shanchan and he led Anders' armies as his sister's first prince of the sword, he had met many two rivermen who favoured the bow, and that taught him more than he had learned in years of reluctant practice in the royal palace's yard. He stood on the terraced roof of the village's small smithy, standing tall behind the lip of fired clay tiles. From here, he could see the main dirt road running through the heart of the village, flanked by squat stone and timber houses, some already burning. Smoke rolled low, stinging the eyes, carrying the sharp scent of pitch and burnt lime plaster. The fighting was thickest at the flower hearth. Some 36 iron-born reavers pressed the attack there, a single banner of the black and gold crocken snapping above their heads. They surged against the inn and the September that abutted it like a tide breaking against rock. The September's low walls were crowded with villagers, men and boys armed with spears, pikes, even shovels and wood axes, jabbing desperately at any reaver who came too close. Fear and desperation lent them strength, but fear alone would not hold forever. They were no warriors, Galad could see that clearly. They would break at the first breach. Luckily, most of the Ironborn were not bothering with them. Their focus was the inn. The flower hearth's first 2 floors were built of stone and bricks. Its doors and windows had been barricaded from within, furniture and beams dragged into place. A low wall enclosed its sides and back, meant for livestock and stabling horses in quieter times. The wooden gate in that wall lay smashed, splintered inward, and there the true fighting raged. 4 Tyrell guards held the narrow entrance to the back courtyard. They stood shoulder to shoulder like a palisade of limbs and steel, their shields locked, blades slick with blood. More men filled the gaps behind, striking when they could with swords and spears. Ironmen threw themselves madly at them. Shields shoved against shields. Swords and axes slashed down in great arcs. He could hear the shouting like a distant song, rough curses interspersed with encouragement from the men who stood behind the lines of each side. Bodies lay heaped to both ends, reachmen in green and gold, ironborn in mail and leather, both trampled into the dirt. Galad's eyes tracked it all with keen awareness. As he'd thought, this was no simple raid. If it had been, the reavers would have scattered through the village, dragging women from houses, looting what they could carry, setting fires and fleeing back to their ships before a proper response could be mustered. Instead, they had burned what they pleased and then committed their strength here, against a heavily guarded position brimming with fighting men. They knew the Tyrells were inside. Surely they knew. And if they took the lords of the Reach Galad knew to be there, Mace Tyrell, his high tower lady wife, and the famous Lady Olenna Tyrell, they could cripple one of the 3 great fleets of the 7 kingdoms who stood against them, the largest amongst them to boot. Those thoughts came at him, tried to shake him and fill his nerves, only to break against the void of his mind. He loosed again. This time the arrow took an ironborn halfway up the chest as he scrambled over the low wall at the inside with some stacked pallets. The impact knocked the breath from him and he toppled backward, legs tangling. Before he could recover, the Tyrell men on the other side of the wall leaned over and finished him with swift, brutal strokes. Galad did not watch him die. He counted instead. 2 arrows spent. 4 left. As a hunter, he had never needed many. 1 for the kill, another if fortune turned ill. A few more for the sake of it, gathered over the years. He had not come here expecting a battlefield. His second shot did not go unnoticed. A reaver close to the one climbing over the wall scrambled out of view, and he must have passed the word. One man in full plate armor looked up and spotted Galad's silhouette against the smoke-darkened sky. He pointed at him, screaming, and heads turned. Some, the ones battering at the doors and windows of the inn, abandoned their posts to seek cover, hiding behind houses and outbuildings nearby. Those locked against the Tyrell guards at the gate fought on, too committed to break away. A line of shieldmen pulled together behind them, a little bedraggled in form, but Galad was surprised at the responsiveness. He had not heard good things about the Ironborn's discipline in battle. But 3 men broke from the press and charged down the road toward the smithy, shields raised over their heads. Galad had expected it. To reach him they had to cross open ground, the width of the street, with no cover but their shields and their courage. In the oneness, there was no hesitation, no flicker of doubt or fear. He drew and aimed at the first man. The arrow flew true, slipping beneath the rim of the raised shield and biting into the man's ribs, just below the arm. He cried out and fell, shield clattering from his grasp. The other two faltered, and the hesitation cost them. A rider erupted from a side alley. Lorne burst into the street at a gallop, polished helm gleaming despite the smoke choking the sun. Leaning from the saddle, he cut one of the reavers down in a single savage swing, steel shearing through mail and flesh alike. The last Ironborn barely had time to turn. Lorne's mount, Galad's own horse his caretaker had bought some years back, hit him full on. The trained destrier reared and struck, iron-shod hooves smashing the man into the dirt. He tried to raise his arms to defend himself, but the horse stamped again and again, until there was nothing left to defend. Galad lowered his bow. With only 3 arrows left and the certainty that at least a dozen eyes now knew where he had been, he did not linger on the rooftop. Sliding back from the edge of the roof, he took the narrow stairs down through the smithy, the steps creaking beneath his weight. The sound seemed oddly loud and echoey considering the roar of battle outside. The modest home stood empty. No voices, no signs of the smith and his family. Just the faint metallic tang of iron and oil that always clung to the place. That told him enough. Brian would be fighting, then. Or dead. The thought came and went without ceremony. Brian the smith was one of the few villagers Galad knew well. He had sharpened Galad's tools, forged iron shoes for his animals, sold him arrowheads some of which were lodged in iron-born flesh even now. Galad had known the village as a whole, of course. He did business with any open to it, trading meat and hides and anything else he could get his hands on, but he had never truly belonged. In his past life, he had wrapped himself in a righteous certainty that was as rigid as any armor. He had traveled through many roads, his days crowded with causes and conflicts and mistakes that still haunted him. But for the 17 years he lived in this world, he had chosen to live simply. Long hours in the garden with his hands in the soil. Days alone in the woods, stalking game, measuring his patience with that of prey. Practicing with the old man, Sir Garin Sand, his only true company for all this time. Lately, other company had tried to find him in the form of marriage offers, families with daughters of age testing the waters. He had declined them all, of course, politely and firmly. He wondered, now, if the girls he had turned away were huddled behind the September slow walls, or barricaded inside the flower hearth, praying the stone would hold. He hoped they were. He well knew the reputation of the Ironborn. Exiting the house, Galad stepped out into the street. The dead lay where they had fallen here, scattered like refuse after a storm. The baker's second son lay face down near the corner of a house, his spine split by a savage blow that had opened him nearly in two. Galad remembered him as a boy mooning over Sir Garin whenever they came into the village, begging the cantankerous old knight for sword lessons. An older woman was slumped against a wall, skirts dark with blood, both hands pressed to her belly as if still trying to hold herself together. Her eyes were closed. Peaceful, if such a word could be allowed. Close by, a young woman he had once seen going to the September lay on her side as if only sleeping. Her dress was torn open, her legs bare. Galad looked once and then no more. He hoped she had died quickly, before cruelty had time to find her. Others lay scattered along the road, at least half a dozen villagers, along with 1 or 2 Tyrell guards and Ironborn who had fallen in the first clash. Anger rose within him, sharp like a hot blade, only to wash against the void of his mind and fade as quickly as it had come. He had practiced the oneness since childhood here, long before he could form the words for why he needed it. For years, it had been the only way to live with the knowledge that he had died once already, that everything he had known had ended, and that he had awakened beneath a different sky with memory intact and no answers given. He lifted his gaze and looked around. Lorne had withdrawn back into the side alley, out of sight, waiting for the moment Galad would draw the enemy's attention again. Good. His plan was simple. Lorne would charge only when the Ironborn were already committed and distracted, even if it meant Galad would be outnumbered before the guard came. While skeptical at first, Lorne had seen enough of Galad's handiwork back in his home to question his skills. He walked forward at an easy pace, boots crunching over dirt and splintered wood, passing the 3 Ironborn corpses he and Lorne had made moments before. He considered reclaiming 1 arrow, but the shaft lay snapped beneath the weight of the dead man's body. No matter. Movement above drew his eye. An Ironborn had climbed to the 2nd floor of the inn, using a ladder set against the stone wall out of Galad's sight from the smithy roof. The man was hacking at a shutter now, axe biting into wood already split and cracking. Galad drew as he walked, fired without pausing, and the arrow took the man beneath the chin, drove upward, and burst out through the back of his skull in a spray of blood and bone. The body pitched forward, bounced once against the stone, and fell with a dull, final thud onto the street. The two men holding the ladder turned to stare at him, but Galad did not stop moving. He drew again and loosed. The arrow entered one man's open mouth and exited the back of his neck, snapping his head violently backward. The second screamed and charged, shield raised over his chest and face. Galad shot him through the thigh. At such close range, the impact must have shattered bone. The man's leg folded beneath him and he fell hard, screaming in pain. Letting the bow slip from his hand, Galad drew his sword and removed the man's head in a single, practiced stroke. It rolled once, then came to rest against the ladder. Once again, his actions had not gone unnoticed. Those battering at the windows and door turned, shouting warnings. One window gave way in a crash of splintered wood as he watched. An ironborn tried to force himself through the gap, only to die screaming as a pot-bellied cook inside, apron pulled tight against his gut, drove a long iron roasting fork through his chest and pinned him there, impaled against the frame. Without waiting for further invitation, Galad ran straight at them, blade raised, and the first man fell with his throat open cleanly. Another died a heartbeat later to the same parry and slash, Galad's sword slipping beneath his helm and through the soft flesh under the jaw. 4 ironborn broke from the door and charged him together with axes and shields. He gave ground deliberately, as they likely expected. It drew them away from the press at the entrance and further onto the open street. The first blow he blocked, steel ringing. The second he parried aside. The third man he killed outright, driving his sword through the eye slit of the helm, then kicked the body into the fourth with enough force to stagger him. Hooves thundered behind, then Lorne crashed into them from the flank, blade flashing as he swung in a brutal arc that split the first man nearly in two. Blood sprayed across the dirt. The second ironborn froze for just an instant too long. Dashing in, Galad evaded an awkward thrust and cut him at the hamstring. The man screamed and collapsed to one knee, clattering from his grasp. He turned at once to meet the fourth, and this one knew what he was doing. His guard was tight, his stance disciplined. They traded blows in quick succession, steel rasping against steel. He pressed Galad back a step, then another, forcing him to work. After a moment, Galad let himself stumble. The ironborn believed it and overcommit, swinging wide for a killing blow. Galad twisted aside at the last instant and drove his sword into the gap in the mail at the groin. The scream that came was high and piercing, and he had the mercy to finish the man cleanly. Behind him, Lorne finished the hamstrung man without ceremony. He took a moment to breathe. The ironborn numbers were thinning now. At a quick glance, Galad counted perhaps 12 still fighting at the side gate. Their formation was ragged as men died on both sides, and he wondered how many still lived inside. Turning back, he nodded once to Lorne, and the guard dismounted. He handed over the reins quickly, then moved toward the broken window, shouting to the people inside. They would need coordination now, to pincer the ironmen from within and without. Galad mounted. From his seat, his eyes easily found the well-armored ironborn shouting orders near the gate. His helm was crested with spikes, his heavy axe already darkened with blood, dents on the blade. That was the one. He gathered the reins and turned the horse toward him. Chapter 5. Lady Olenna Tyrell. When the whole tiresome ordeal began, Olenna Tyrell had been eating figs. They were good figs, too, plump and dark with none of that tartness she hated that gave her reflux. The only good thing to come out of this misery. Why, oh why, had the Lord Oaf of Highgarden decided on an outing today of all days? When the guards outside started bellowing something, and the word ironborn carried clearly enough to be the only thing she could comprehend, the hens descended on her at once. Aelry, pale like a ghost already, grasped her arm as if Olenna would be the one to protect her from those brutes. The two ladies-in-waiting fluttered like startled doves too, already speaking over one another, already deciding that upstairs was safer because it was upstairs, as if a few steps would stop the ironborn once they made their way inside. Someone tugged at her elbow. Someone else began crying. They wanted her up the stairs. Olenna stared at them for a long moment, then clicked her tongue. "Don't be ridiculous," she said, settling more firmly into her chair. "If they break in, what difference does it make whether I die in a bed or on a bench? At least here I won't have to climb." Her hip had been troublesome all morning. She was not about to worsen it for the sake of panic. They had tried anyway, of course. They always did. Between the four of them they had nearly managed to haul her halfway up the steps before a crash from above. Wood splintered, then a man's scream. That sent them all shrieking back down again, and the retreat had been less dignified than the attempt. Now they huddled in the common room. Olenna and the hens, cooks with white faces and bloody hands, servants clutching one another, and a single Tyrell guard stationed by the barricaded door, sweating through his mail. The air was thick with smoke and fear and the sour tang of spilled ale. Olenna sighed. The one day she did not have Eric and Eric with her. Loyal, humorless, wonderfully dependable Eric and Eric, who would have formed a 7-foot wall of steel and scowls between her and any fool with an axe. Instead, she had, this. A single guard whose knees were visibly considering betrayal. That and those 20 men out there who were, unfortunately, being commanded by her son. The thought alone made her shiver. Gods help us! Then the pounding at the doors stopped. For a terrible moment, the room went utterly still. Someone sobbed softly. Olenna felt the weight of that silence settle in her chest, but she did not let that fear show. If the world had decided this was it for her, then so be it. They must have broken through the side gate, one of the cooks whispered. Quiet, Olenna snapped, though her own heart gave an unwelcome lurch. If the Ironborn had stopped trying the door, it meant they might have truly made their way inside elsewhere. If they did, there would be no warning. No time for last words. No opportunity to tell Mace. She cut that thought off sharply. Getting weepy now would do no one any good. Then, scarcely a minute later, movement at the window caught her eye. A mustached face appeared behind the body of a dead Ironborn wedged awkwardly in the shattered frame, skewered clean through the chest by a roasting fork. Blood dripped steadily onto the sill. The face beyond it, however, was very much alive. Tell the men to sortie out. The man shouted, far louder than was strictly necessary. Sortie out now. Olenna winced. Did everyone insist on bellowing during crises? Had whispering gone out of fashion while she wasn't looking? The room froze. No one moved. The guard stared at the window as though the man outside had been speaking in rough Dothraki. Olenna huffed. Well, she said sharply. Go on, then. The guard blinked at her, eyes wide, as though only just realizing she still existed. Then he lurched into motion, running around the bar and wrenching the kitchen door open just long enough to shout for Mace and the others in the backyard before slamming it shut again. Mace. Olenna snorted softly to herself. Her oaf of a son was probably puffing and preening out there, convinced that courage was something you shouted loudly enough until it appeared. She had made herself quite clear before the fighting reached its worst, let the men do the fighting, and if you must die, then die productively. Take at least one Ironborn with you, preferably one with a sigil worth dying to. She had raised him better than this. Or perhaps not. Olenna sighed. At least Willis was not here. That thought steadied her more than she liked to admit. Willis, Garland, Loras, Marjorie. Gone on their pleasant little trek through the forest, spared this horror. Sensible children, for once, assuming they had the wit to turn back at the first sign of smoke and do what Tyrells had always done best, retreat, regroup, and endure. The family could survive losses. It could not survive stupidity. A wonder they had survived this long with Mace at the helm, truly. A hushed voice cut through her thoughts. That's Lorne, one of the servants whispered, peering toward the window. He was with Lord Willis. Olenna's heart stopped. Frozen in absolute cold for a second, as if someone had reached inside her chest and seized. Aelry whipped around, fear flooding her face anew. What? She demanded. Are you certain? The servant nodded, trembling. Yes, my lady. Him and Ben. They went with the little lord. Olenna closed her eyes and exhaled slowly through her nose. No, no. It couldn't be. Had Willis truly chosen this moment to inherit his father's worst instincts? Had he decided that heroics were finally in order, that 2 men and a middling squire against Ironborn reavers was a gamble worth taking? Clever boy, thoughtful boy. Foolish boy, if so. If he was out there now, behind the Ironborn lines, then there was nothing Olenna could do. No sharp word could reach him. No threat, no counsel, no withering look. She reached for a date and popped it into her mouth. It was sticky and sweet, heavy on the tongue. Good for digestion, the maester claimed. She chewed thoughtfully. If things went badly, if the doors gave way and the axes came down, then at least she would leave the Ironborn something to remember her by. A final, fragrant gift. She would not smell of roses then. She always hated roses anyway. They knew the sortie succeeded because the noise changed. The fighting had rung through the inn for what felt like hours, every impact reverberating through the stone and wood until her head throbbed in time with it. If the Ironborn did not kill her with sword or axe, they would do it with noise. Then the cheers burst out from the men, rolling through the common room like a physical thing, setting cups rattling and making several of the servants gasp as if struck. Olenna winced and brought a hand to her temple. More shouting followed the cheers, only this time it was not the incoherent war cries boys like to scream out when they were poking each other with sharp sticks until one burst like a wineskin. It was men calling orders, others crying out as they fled or fell or thanked the gods. It was all very dramatic. And over it all, unmistakable as a storm breaking, Mace's thunderous voice. Of course he was shouting. Inside, the hens dissolved into tears and laughter in equal measure. One of the cooks seized a servant girl by the shoulders and kissed her with such fervor that the girl nearly folded in half, knocking over a stool in the process. Someone clapped. Someone prayed aloud. Someone else laughed hysterically. Olenna watched it all with a faint curl to her lip. They cheered as though they had swung the swords, she thought, as though their little prayers and songs could be heard outside while men bled and died and shat themselves. When Aelry moved to embrace her, eyes bright and wet, Olenna waved her away without looking. Enough flapping, she muttered. A few minutes later, the door at the back of the kitchen opened, and Mace Tyrell strode into the common room as if making an entrance at a feast. He was smiling broadly, chest puffed, hair only slightly mussed. Sweat darkened his doublet beneath the arms and along the breast, but otherwise his clothes were pristine. So he had not fought. Good. Even in armor, he would have been more obstruction than advantage. Though, Olenna supposed, he might have managed to fill the narrow gate all by himself if the Ironborn had tried to squeeze past him. There were uses for such a prodigious bulk. What caught her attention was that he was not alone. Behind him came Lorne, the guard who was meant to be with the children. And beside Lorne, a young man Olenna did not recognize. One glance told her that he had seen real fighting. Blood streaked his face and neck, dried dark against his skin, and his clothes bore the same marks, though they were torn nowhere. His sword, interestingly enough, was clean. Very interesting. He was handsome, too, strikingly so. Tall, dark-haired, built like a knight despite his obvious youth, face all sharp angles as if carved from a block of pale marble. Olenna had seen beautiful men in her time. Her own Targaryen betrothed, Durin, had been easy on the eyes, if lacking in every quality that made a man worth keeping. But this one had the eyes of the Targaryens, a dashing purple, with nothing of that Valyrian foppishness she had come to despise. In her youth, Olenna reflected dryly, she would not have minded being seized and folded over with a kiss by such a young man. When Mace and Aelry finally disentangled themselves, she spoke. "Very well, Mace," she said. "Enough of that now. Is it done?" Mace beamed as if she had asked him whether the sun had risen. "Yes, mother. The battle is over. We have come out victorious against fearful odds. The battle of the flower hearth, yes, I can already hear the songs." Olenna suppressed a groan. "And it would not have been possible without our hero here," Mace continued, gesturing grandly at the young man. "Truly?" Aelry asked in that thin, fluttering voice of hers. Olenna rolled her eyes. Gods, but the woman could be dull at times. Which was most of them, unfortunately. "Yes, my love, truly," Mace said. "This young man fought like the legends of old. I saw him cut down 5 men in seconds before he took on the Ironborn captain, and what a duel that was." Yes, marvellous," Olenna cut in, annoyed. "But where is Willis?" The room stilled again. "And Garland," she went on, eyes narrowing, "and Loras and Marjorie. Were they not supposed to be with you, man?" Her gaze snapped to Lorne, who stiffened as if bracing for a blow. "Well? Out with it," she demanded. What followed was, Olenna decided, a fantastical tale, even by Reachman standards, despite how taciturn the teller sounded. Lorne spoke of meeting this young man in the forest, a simple woodsman by his account, of a sudden Ironborn attack at the man's home, of a desperate flight toward the village. He told of Galad the woodsman convincing Willis to take the children and flee toward Highgarden. Of the fight outside the inn, of charges and counter-charges, of Ironborn falling like wheat before a scythe. By the time he finished, the small crowd had gathered closer, whispering and gasping, eyes fixed on Galad as though he might sprout wings at any moment. Aelry and the hens descended upon him with thanks and praise, one bold girl even pressing a kiss to each of his cheeks. The young man himself accepted it all without flinching or blushing. That, Olenna noted, was the strangest thing of all. No nervous fidgeting. No false modesty. He stood there in bloodied silence, face composed as a lacquered mask. Battle shock, perhaps. Some men went oddly still after fighting, as though their souls had not yet caught up with their bodies. Mace spoke again. I have already sent men up the road for the children, he said. Another thing we must thank you for, young man. Truly, your deeds are worthy of song. Olenna felt a familiar tightening behind her eyes. Not song, Mace corrected himself, warming to the sound of his own voice. Knighthood. Lordship, in fact. There it was. His eyes gleamed with a light Olenna did not like at all. Dustinbury stands empty, he went on. A castle in need of a noble lord. And after today, I would be hard-pressed to name a more noble man than you, young Galad. Kneel, swear me your oaths, and I will make you lord of Dustinbury here and... Mace. Her voice cut through the room without her needing to raise it. Her son froze as if she had struck him, and Olenna fixed him with a glare he had known since childhood, one that promised consequences. We will speak of rewards later, she said coldly. I am sure the young man is terribly weary after such an ordeal. Are you not, boy? She said it to test him, to needle him. Galad the woodsman merely inclined his head, neither eager nor offended. See. Olenna continued. He can barely speak. We can discuss awarding him knighthood, she put sharp emphasis on the word, when we are safely behind the walls of Highgarden. Her word was final. Mace blustered and puffed, but she had already dismissed him. Her attention remained on the young man standing quietly in the dim light of the common room. Hero or not, Olenna Tyrell thought, she would not be handing out lordships to the first woodsman who proved adept with a sharp stick. But she would very much like to know where he had learned to wield it. Chapter 6. He would have returned to his cabin if the children had not begged him to come with them to Highgarden. That was the simple truth of it, though not the whole. Once the riders brought them back, they clung to his sleeves and spoke over one another, voices still bright with relief and awe, calling him sir already, as if the word itself might keep him close. Lord Willis had almost cried at seeing him alive. He thanked him thrice over, for fighting for them at the house, for convincing him of his foolishness, and for saving his family against all odds in the inn. Galad thought him a sensible young man who would make for a good lord once his father vacated the post. The middle boy, Garland, had begged him to teach him the sword, while little Loras and Marjorie insisted to their parents they would have no sworn shield other than Galad. Even then, he might have refused, might have bowed and taken his leave once the Tyrells departed. But then he had seen the village after the fighting was done and the real damage was accounted for. There were far more bodies than he had noticed when he first came in from the trees with bow in hand. Every alley and doorway was splattered with blood, every half-burned home held a body or two of those who thought themselves safe behind their own walls. Many of them he knew by name. Faces that had once nodded to him in passing, hands that had taken coin from him at market. Brian the smith lay beneath the walls of the September, his broad body twisted awkwardly. He was stabbed in the chest while defending his neighbors and family, his hammer still looped through his belt. The man had never held a sword in his life, yet he had died by one. That was not the worst. Late in the day, after most of the wounded had been tended and the dead laid out, they found 5 women inside a house at the edge of the village. 2 of them girls still. When he saw them, Galad had turned away and walked until the sounds of the village faded, until he was alone beneath the trees, and there he had sought the oneness with a desperation he had not felt since he heard what had been done to the woman who he thought of as a mother a lifetime ago. What had been done in that house looked like the work of Trollocs. He had not seen such creatures in this life, but the memory of their cruelty lived like a badly healed scar inside of him. Trolloc or not, he well knew the truth of the world, though. Some men chose to be monsters even when they were not born as one. That was when Galad had decided what he would do. The next day, Lord Mace Tyrell received him in what remained of the inn, still flushed with victory and already speaking of banners and retaliation. As his boon, Galad asked only for the means to fight the Ironborn. The Lord blinked as though he had misheard. You ask too little, Mace said. After what you did. You should name gold, lands, honors. Highgarden will sing of this day. Galad had met his gaze evenly. Blood was what he wanted then. Not for himself, but for Brian, for the baker's boy, and for the women whose names would never be sung. Justice, such as this world allowed. Lady Olenna, as he was starting to expect, had been sharper. She had wanted him close, bound by oath as a sworn sword to her family. To look after the children, she said, as if that alone would move him. Galad had refused that as well, as gently as he could. He would not tie himself to any man or house beyond the war itself. In the end, it was Olenna who named the compromise, and Mace, after much blustering, had agreed. Before they left, Galad would be knighted quietly, as he asked. And once his affairs in the village were settled, he would go to Highgarden where he would be given arms and armor, quarters within the castle, and a place in the Tyrell household while the banners of the Reach assembled. He would serve under them until the Ironborn rebellion was broken. After that, he would be free to go. To seek your fortunes wherever you may wish, Lady Olenna had said, her eyes watching him like a hawk's. Galad had inclined his head and let the words lie. He had no great wishes for fortune, no dreams of lands or halls. Truth be told, he did not know what he wished at all. He had hidden himself in a quiet corner of the world for 17 years, content with hunting and seeing to his vegetables. Foolishly, he had believed that if he did not seek conflict, it might pass him by. Instead, war had found him on its own. He remained in the village for 2 more weeks. There were graves to dig, walls to repair, roofs to patch before the spring rains came. He worked alongside the others until his hands blistered and his back ached. Each morning he took whatever task was left undone. Each night he slept poorly. The people treated him differently now. They thanked him too much. They watched him as if he might refuse them. When he reached for a shovel, someone else would hurry to take it from him. He had to insist, more than once, before they would let him work. That was when he understood that he could not stay, even if he had wanted to. The life he had lived there was gone. Even if the Ironborn never returned, it would not be simple again. 2 weeks after the attack, Galad rode toward the gates of Highgarden. Despite living within a few hours' ride of the great castle all his life, he had never seen it before. Never felt the need. Now it rose before him atop a verdant hill, white walls gleaming in the sun, 3 great tiers climbing toward the heart of the keep. Between the outer and middle walls sprawled the briar labyrinth, green and cunningly shaped, its paths hidden beneath flowering hedges. Beneath it all, the Mander wound through the land like a silver ribbon, a small town sitting against its banks. He took it in without awe. Palaces and royal halls had filled his past life, stone and splendor had long since lost their power to move him. At the gatehouse, his name set a chain of motion into place. A guardsman called for his superior, who called for a captain, who finally nodded and waved him through. Inside, a steward met him, a harried man with ink-stained fingers who barely spared Galad a glance as he led him through corridors already echoing with voices and bootsteps. He was shown his quarters, modest but clean, and told he would be fitted for armor on the morrow. The steward rattled off directions to the kitchens, the September, the gods' wood, places to eat, to pray, to escape the growing press of lords and knights arriving from every corner of the Reach. And there would be a feast that night, he added, as Lords Rowan, Tarly and Fossoway of Cider Hall were expected before sunset. Before the man could leave, Galad asked only one thing. The steward blinked, then pointed him the way. Soon the practice yard lay open before him, wide enough to hold a small town. He watched as hundreds of men trained beneath the open sky. Steel rang against steel. Shouts carried over packed earth and cobblestones. And even here, the divisions were clear. Guards and men-at-arms drilled on one side, their gear serviceable and worn. On the other, knights and lords sparred in finer armor, their movements watched by squires who hovered with towels and waterskins. He scanned the nearer group and spotted a familiar mustache before he recognized the man beneath it. Lorne stood by one of the fountains, arms folded as 2 younger men sparred in front of him. He did not fight, but he did not stand idle either. Every few moments he barked a correction or a warning, tapping a boot against the stone when one of the men overextended or let his guard drift. He would not call the man a friend, but at least he knew him. After gathering a dull sword from the rack, he crossed the yard in his direction, and Lorne noticed him when he was only a few steps away. His eyes widened, just slightly, before he straightened and gave a deep nod. "Sir Galad," he said. "Just arrived." Galad returned the nod. Today. Welcome to Highgarden. One of the younger men glanced over, breathing hard. That's the one they knighted with you. Lorne did not answer beyond a grunt. Can't believe we missed the action, the man went on, rolling his shoulders. The other added, lowering his practice sword. I'd have been knighted too if I'd been there. If the old man and the pretty boy were. Galad did not look at him. He rested his hand on the pommel of his blunted sword and waited. If he were bothered by every man who spoke to him in jealousy, he'd have fought more honor duels than battles by now. Lorne stepped forward and scuffed the speaker on the side of the head with 2 fingers. He yelped. It'd take 3 of you to do half of what I could, boy, Lorne said. And there ain't enough men in this yard to do what Sir Galad here done. The young man scoffed. Enough of that. Ain't no one believe you and him fought off a whole Ironborn crew on your own. Leave the songs to the kitchen maids. It's Sir Lorne now, Lorne replied evenly, and ain't no one said it was the whole crew. Half of it, more like. Lord Mace himself saw it. You calling him a liar? The young man stiffened. I weren't calling the Lord a liar. He turned to the other boy. Were you? A head shook. I weren't neither. Good, Lorne said. Now get back to it, or I won't help you no more. The 2 guards resumed sparring, their movements a touch more careful than before. Galad watched them without comment. Their footwork was sloppy. Both lifted their swords too high on the swing. One favored his left side and left it open every time he pressed. He saw it all after a quick glance and said nothing. Once, he would have corrected them without thinking. He would have spoken plainly and sharply, and wondered afterward why no one wished to speak with him again. I fought with his father in the Stormlands, Lorne said, nodding at one of the sparring men. Good fellow. This one's not half the man he was. I heard that, the young man said. I know, Lorne replied. Galad turned to him. I was not aware you had been knighted as well. You have my congratulations. Lorne waved it off. And you my thanks. But you should know, now that you're a knight, you can train over there. He jerked his chin toward the highborn side of the yard. Galad raised an eyebrow and looked at him. And you cannot. I could, Lorne said. But then I'd have to deal with them. A brief smile tugged at his mouth. Is it always like this? Galad asked. Worse now, Lorne said. With all the lords arriving. Galad nodded. When do we march? Lorne shrugged. When Lord Mace decides. Last I heard, Prince Stannis is still halfway across the Dornish coast with the royal fleet. Best break the Ironborn at sea before we go throwing men onto transport ships. It made sense. Galad accepted it without comment. With the other kingdoms also joining the fight, he did not expect the Reach to send more than 20,000 men once the banners finished gathering. They could raise far more, but excess numbers would only slow a campaign like this. Shall we? He asked. With a grunt, Lorne reached for his practice sword. Why not? They squared off near the fountain. Galad moved lightly, testing rather than pressing. He did not force the pace or strike with full strength. Instead, he let Lorne come to him, watching how the man shifted his weight, how his guard rose and fell. When an opening appeared, Galad touched it and withdrew, again and again, never the same place twice. Lorne adjusted slowly. The man was no Blademaster, but soon enough his guard tightened. He started covering one weakness, then another. Galad eased the pressure just enough to let the lesson settle before offering the next. After several minutes, Lorne stepped back, breathing hard, sweat running down his temples. 7 hells, he muttered, wiping his brow. Who did you say trained you? Names rose unbidden in his mind. Gareth Brine. Hammer Gaydon. Henry Haslin. His brother Gayen, always beside him in the yard. Matrim Cawthon, grinning as he knocked them both flat with a quarterstaff. Sometimes a man learned more from his peers and opponents than his mentors. In the end, he settled on the only name that meant anything in this world. Sir Garin Sand, he said. Lorne blinked. Never heard of him. Nor me, someone said. Galad lowered his sword as footsteps approached. He turned and saw a tall man coming toward them. He was well-built and plainly noble, young still, perhaps entering his 3rd decade, but already going bald at the temples. The 3 guards stopped as the man approached. Each straightened and dipped his head. Not deeply, but enough to mark respect. Sir Owen, they said. The man did not slow his stride. He gave them a brief nod, eyes already past them. On you go, fellows. The men hesitated. Lorne scowled, but none of them argued. One by one, they stepped away, leaving Galad alone with the newcomer. Might I help you, Sir? He asked. This Sir Owen had dismissed the others deliberately. That much was obvious. He smiled widely now, a practiced thing. The sort of smile meant to put others at ease. Galad had seen plenty of those. Sir Owen Inchfield, he said for an introduction. I was training nearby and could not help overhearing that you are the new knight. Sir Galad. Galad glanced around the yard quickly. Knights of birth and standing trained on the far side, near the shade. A man with a noble last name would not be training nearby the guards and men at arms. Still, he understood courtesies had to be observed. Honored to make your acquaintance, Sir Owen. He offered a small bow. The honor is mine, Owen Inchfield replied, though his tone suggested otherwise. He was not as good an actor as he thought himself to be. We all heard so much of your battle from Lord Mace. I thought I might test my sword arm against a man of your reputation. Nodding slowly, Galad gave himself a moment to study the man. Owen was broad and moved with confidence, though his stance betrayed impatience rather than discipline. His hand seemed to itch on his practiced sword. He had not come for instruction or fellowship or curiosity, that much was certain. It was a challenge, and not the friendly kind. A younger Galad would have answered it without hesitation. He would have ended the spar quickly, publicly, and without apology. Not even as a statement. Simply because it was the thing to do. That instinct stirred now, but he pushed it aside. As you wish, Galad said, inclining his head. They took their places, and Sir Owen attacked the moment Galad raised his sword, swinging hard and fast. The knight treated the blunted blade as if it were sharpened steel and he meant to cut Galad in twine. Overhead, side swing, a thrust to the throat. Using his size, each strike was meant to overwhelm rather than probe. Galad stepped back, letting the blows glance off his guard, turning his wrists just enough to redirect force without meeting it directly. Owen pressed harder. His boots slapped against damp earth as he advanced, hacking downward, then across, then back again. Galad gave ground steadily, eyes tracking Owen's shoulders, his hips, the way his weight shifted before each strike. Fight back, Sir Owen grunted. Are you not the hero of Dustinbury? Galad saw no need to answer. Dull steel rang as they traded blows. He spotted openings in every move. Owen's right side dipped when he swung high. His balance faltered after wide cuts. His instincts screamed at him to follow through on the parry, step inside the knight's guard and slice at the shoulder line. He could almost hear Gareth Bryne's voice telling him to end it quickly. Galad ignored them all, letting the spar stretch on. He kept his movements tight, shifting slightly on the balls of his feet. Meanwhile, Sir Owen's breathing grew louder, harsher. Frustration crept into his movements until his blows lost precision, though not strength. With a discontented growl, Owen lashed out with his foot, aiming for Galad's knee. A foul strike that might cripple him if it connected. He shifted aside quick as a cat, the movement almost automatic. Owen's boot slid instead of planting. The puddle by the fountain caught him at the worst possible moment and his weight kept going forward. His legs shot apart and he went down hard, yelping as both hands flew to his groin. Galad stared awkwardly, his sword going down to his side. Are you well, Sir? He asked. The reply came as a string of curses, some of them slurred by pain. Laughter broke out around the yard. Several men turned away, shoulders shaking. Others covered their mouths, failing to hide their amusement. The word maester carried clearly through the noise. 2 guards hurried forward to help him up. Owen clung to them, face flushed, still swearing. Galad stepped back another pace and lowered his sword fully. Looking around, he noticed eyes were on him now. More than he liked. Some whispering, others pointing. He had heard of House Inchfield before, though he did not have the education to know how high in the hierarchy a knight of such a house ranked in the social ladder. He did not need people thinking he had just injured a high noble during a spar. He sighed. So much for a relaxing hour at the yard. Galad had no wish to explain himself, so he nodded once to Lorne, then turned and left the yard without another word. Chapter 7. With murmurs rising at his back, he followed the steward's directions away from the noise, moving through covered walkways and into the godswood that rose nearby. The sounds of steel and shouted commands faded behind him as the path narrowed and trees closed in. Highgarden's godswood was thick with greenery, carefully tended but allowed to grow dense. Moss clung to stones. Small ponds appeared from the earth like sapphires, the water gleaming in the sun. The air was cooler here, the shade a nice reprieve from the sun. He found the great weirwoods at the center. Not one tree, as he heard was usual for such a place, but three, their pale trunks rising close together. Their branches intertwined overhead, leaves thick and red, forming a canopy broad enough to dim the light below. The bark was smooth and white, marked with dark knots and shallow cuts left by time. Aside from the carved faces, that is, staring back at him with red sap streaming from dark eyes like tears of blood. Galad paused a few paces away, as if stopped by their glance. A knowing glance. He had heard of the weirwoods, of course, of the old gods. They were not well liked in the Reach where the faith of the Seven reigned supreme, but they still had adherents in the north. But whether north or south, Westeros or Essos, no one knew of the creator here. Of the light. Was this another world entirely, or simply another turning of the wheel? Perhaps the first turning, before creation even knew about creator. He shook his head. He did not wish to lose himself to philosophies and religious thoughts. Should the Dark One ever appear, Galad would fight him either way. No need to tie himself into knots about it. The three singers, a voice said behind him. He turned to see a young woman standing at the edge of the clearing. She was close to his age, with brown hair pulled back loosely and eyes the color of honey. Her cheeks were flushed red. "Forgive me, sire," she said, smiling. "I did not mean to startle you." "No forgiveness is needed," Galad replied, inclining his head. "I was only admiring the trees. This place feels old." She walked closer. "As old as the castle itself. They say Garth Greenhand planted these weirwoods with his own hands." Galad did not answer. Garth Greenhand was as famous a name in the Reach as the king in the Iron Throne. He turned back to the trunks. The sensation had not left, like someone standing just over your shoulder. A subtle thing, faint, but the hairs on the back of his neck stood on edge. He reached for the oneness with a conscious thought, slowing his breathing, letting all his emotions fade into the void. Birds chirped overhead. He saw a beetle crawling across a leaf 10 yards away. A butterfly took off from a floriade to the side, and he thought he could hear the batting of its wings if he focused. "I do not know you, sire," the woman said after a moment. "Are you new to Highgarden?" He nodded absently, but his thoughts were not on her. In the oneness, the feeling had only sharpened. He was one with the butterfly in flight. One with the crawling beetle. One with the godswood and the weirwoods. He felt full, as if something pressed around the void, a slow, patient force squeezing around him. Galad frowned. His gaze traced the pale bark, the carved faces staring blindly outward. Were they blind? No, something here noticed him. A throat cleared. Reluctantly, he tore his eyes away from the weirwoods. The young woman was still there, closer this time, clearly expecting more. He turned fully to her. "Yes, my lady," he said. "I arrived earlier today. Forgive me. I was distracted." She studied him openly, head tilting. "Purple eyes," she said. "Black hair. Are you Sir Galad of Dustinbury?" He nodded, and her face lit at once. She stepped closer and caught his arm. "The hero of the flower hearth," she said, voice sweet as a peach. "My name is Victoria Tyrell, sire. You saved my family. You must know how grateful I am." Her hand slid higher, fingers curling around his shoulder. She leaned in, close enough that he could smell her perfume. And the wine on her breath. "Anything, sire," she murmured. She was a beautiful woman, but in the void, such distractions meant nothing. He could think about his and others' actions rationally, and her behavior clearly seemed strange. A lady of her standing throwing herself on a low-born man, even if a knight, raised his hackles. His voice was cold when he spoke. "If you could tell me where I might find the castle's library, I would be grateful." Then he gently removed her arms from his shoulders. That would be more than enough. For a moment she only stared at him, clearly uncertain how to respond. Then she nodded, flustered, and pointed down a winding path. Galad thanked her and took his leave, the sense of being watched lingering behind him as he walked away. A few books on weirwood and the old gods would not be amiss while he waited to march out. XXX Lady Olenna Tyrell. The late afternoon light fell across the stone floor in uneven bands, filtered by the half-drawn shutters. Olenna Tyrell sat across from Victoria at a small table near one of the open windows. She stirred a mug of mint tea with slow irritation, the spoon tapping faintly against the sides. The maesters swore it was good for her teeth. She snorted softly at the thought. She had fewer teeth now than she had cups of the stuff in a week. Victoria shifted under her gaze. The girl tried to sit still after telling her part, hands folded in her lap, posture careful, but her fingers kept twitching. Olenna let the silence stretch. People talked more freely when they were uncomfortable. And he did not seem interested. Olenna asked at last. Victoria straightened. No, my lady. Quite the opposite, in truth. He seemed bothered by me. Olenna paused her stirring. Oh. She raised her eyes. A sword swallower, perhaps. Victoria shook her head. I do not think so. I watched him in the yard before I approached him. His gaze did not linger on anyone. Not even those training without shirts. Unlike yours. Olenna raised a painted eyebrow. Victoria smiled, just a little. Admiring the baker is not the same as eating the cake, my lady. Olenna allowed herself a brief smirk. The girl had a quick tongue when she wished to use it. A shame she had been born a rose too far down the bush. Like Mace, her own daughters had all taken after her dear Luther, sweet, dull, and loud. Strong seed, that man had. Strong and thick in the head. Still, Victoria might yet prove useful. With her name, looks, and Olenna's backing, a high marriage within the reach was not off the table for her. And what did he do after? Olenna asked. He went to the library, Victoria said. I spoke with the attendant afterward. He asked for books. Histories. Treatises on the old gods. Garth Greenhand. The weirwood trees. Olenna stopped stirring altogether. She lifted the mug and took a careful sip, then set it down again. A woodsman who prefers books to pretty flowers. She sucked a breath through her few teeth left. She did not like it. She did not like it at all. What was the name of the man who raised him again? She asked. Sir Garin Sand, Victoria replied. Sand. A Dornish bastard, then. Olenna leaned back in her chair, eyes narrowing slightly as she considered it. Purple eyes did not always mean Valyrian blood. The Dornish had their share of oddities. And Dorne had been quiet. Too quiet, if you asked her. Too many whispers had reached her ears of late. Too many oddities in the known stories. Targaryen sails sighted beyond the narrow sea. 3 Kings Guard who had vanished into the desert and never returned. Stark finding his dead sister by her lonesome on a random tower in Dorne. Royal bodies never recovered. Robert Baratheon wore the crown, but not with the ease Jonaran liked to pretend. Still, it did not quite fit. Why send a Dornish bastard to raise a child in the Reach? Why hide him in plain sight, in a village tied so closely to Highgarden itself? And to what end? Could Doran Martell truly be so patient as all that? To place a man near them, wait years, then arrange for the Ironborn to strike, only for his own creature to save the Tyrells and earn their gratitude? Olenna felt her jaw tighten. Nonsense. She was tying herself in knots, seeing patterns where there were none. Age did that to a woman. Made her suspicious of every shadow. Besides, Mace had decided on that river outing the very same morning. No scheme spun in Son's pair could account for her son's talent for poor timing. She exhaled slowly and turned her attention back to Victoria. And that night you spoke of, Olenna said. I hope you did not give him any false hopes, dear. It will be a cold day at the wall before a Tyrell flower marries an Inchfield, dung beetle. Victoria coloured slightly. Nothing of the sort, my lady. I merely praised Sir Galad's valour within earshot of Sir Owen. That was quite enough. He has been pining for my attention as of late. Olenna's lips twitched. Ah! Owen! It was no wonder Mace was so fond of him. They shared half a brain between the two of them. Indeed, Victoria said. He then saw fit to embarrass himself in front of half the yard. He was quite wroth with Sir Galad last I heard. And the boy? Victoria drew a breath. Leo believes Sir Galad is one of the finest swordsmen he has ever seen, she said. Despite his many shortcomings, my brother says Sir Owen is a fearsome warrior, and yet he is certain our newest knight was holding back throughout the spar. Olenna mulled that. Another fine display of both blade and humility, then, she murmured, more to herself than the girl. She lifted the mug again and took another sip. The tea had gone cold. Beyond the window, Highgarden carried on as it always had. Servants moved along the walkways. Knights crossed the yard. Banners were being unpacked and aired, their colours bright against the white stone. Lords were arriving from every corner of the Reach. Peace had lasted a long time. Too long. The Greyjoy rebellion was only the beginning. Olenna felt that much in her bones, the way she felt rain before it came. Something was stirring. Alliances would shift. Old grudges would resurface. Men would grow ambitious. And into the middle of it all had walked a quiet young knight, as beautiful as a prince from song and legend, with strange eyes and a talent for killing. She did not like pieces she could not place. If the gods are kind, Olenna said at last, the boy will find an honorable end for himself in the war to come. Startled, Victoria looked at her with wide eyes. Do not look so stricken, child. Honor is the best thing a man like that can hope for. Olenna waved a hand. I will not have him killed, if that is your worry. Not yet, at least. She pushed the mug aside and pointed to the door. You have done well, she said. Keep your eyes open, Victoria. Listen more than you speak. I will call for you again soon. Victoria nodded and rose. Yes, my lady. Olenna turned to the window as the girl left, her mind already moving on to the next problem. For the woman who truly ruled the Reach, Galad of Dustinbury was just a tiny drop in a sea of issues. Chapter 8. On his second day in Highgarden, Galad found himself drawn back to the God's Wood. Morning light filtered through the thick canopy above, breaking into pale green shafts that dappled the loam beneath his boots. The sounds of the castle, laughter, bells, the distant clash of practice steel, fell away as soon as he crossed beneath the boughs. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and sap. He let out a sigh. It reminded him faintly of home. Too long used to wooded solitude, this place was a nice relief to his ears and nose. He sat with his back against one of the low stone borders encircling the heart of the grove, a heavy tome resting across his lap. The book had taken some convincing to acquire. The keeper of the library, a thin, nervous man wearing the expression of someone perpetually awaiting disaster, had made Galad swear no fewer than 3 times that he would keep the volume dry, shaded, and well away from clumsy hands or sudden rain. Only then had he allowed the night to carry it out, muttering prayers to the 7 under his breath as Galad departed. The tome itself was thick, its leather cover cracked with age. An account of a short journey beyond the wall, read the title, penned by a maester whose name had been scratched out of the yellowed, stiff pages. After skimming through some rather interesting treatises about the North and the First Men, he had hoped for something much like those, conversations with the wildlings, discussions on culture and religion, a clear description of what lay north of the wall, but the account quickly proved otherwise. The maester had written at length, yet said very little. There were passages filled with awe and terror, others steeped in disdain. The wildlings were painted as little more than animals, savage and uncivilized and barbaric. And in line with the many mentions of the 7, the customs surrounding the old gods and their sacred weirwood trees dismissed as barbaric superstition. Too much fear in the writing, too much revulsion. It did not come off as the writings of a man seeking truth, which frustrated Galad to no end. After a few hours, he closed the book with a quiet thud and let his head rest back against the stone. Books will only take me so far, he thought. A man has to see things with his own eyes. Perhaps he would travel there after the war. If not as far as beyond the wall, then the north at the very least. His gaze lifted, drawn once more to the weirwoods. The 3 singers stood close together at the center of the God's Wood. They rose as 3, but up there in the branches, it was difficult to tell where one ended and another began. Their bark was bone-white as if someone had drawn upon it with chalk. Red leaves stirred faintly above him, the sound like a distant whisper. Their eyes were what unsettled him most. He knew it was foolish. The carvings were ancient, lifeless things, yet as he shifted his position, he could have sworn the eyes followed him. The sensation of being watched crept along his spine. It had not faded with familiarity. If anything, it had sharpened since his first visit. Only in his other life had Galad felt something akin to this. Yet not even the eyeless stare of a murderal, something that might bring the most fearless of men to his knees, had pressed so insistently against his thoughts. That gaze had been predatory, cruel. This was different, though. Vast and old. Indifferent, even, yet curious all the same. He drew a slow breath and reached inward, feeding his unease into the flame he kept banked deep within his mind. Fear, doubt, anticipation. He offered them all up, one by one, until they were consumed. The fire flared briefly, then receded, leaving only stillness. The void welcomed him as an old friend. He rose to his feet and took a few measured steps toward the nearest of the weirwoods, and the pressure returned at once, stronger now, as though something strained against the edges of his awareness. His hand lifted, hovering inches from the pale bark. The sensation intensified. Before his fingers could brush against the trunk, a laugh rang out, bright and clear, shattering the moment. Sir Galad! His hand fell to his side as he turned. From between the trees came two small figures, barreling toward him with reckless speed. He let the void slip away from him. Sir Galad! Sir Galad! They cried in unison. Little Loras Tyrell led the charge, all flailing limbs and white smiles. Beside him ran Marjorie, only a step behind, skirts hitched up in her fists as she laughed. Trailing after them at a more sedate pace was Galad Tyrell, already tall and broad despite his youth, his expression apologetic even as a smile tugged at his mouth. Two guards followed at a respectful distance. Galad's lips curved upward despite himself. Lord Loras! Lady Marjorie, he greeted, inclining his head. This is a happy surprise. I'm afraid I have no firewood for you to chop today. Marjorie skidded to a halt, planting her feet and pouting up at him. Then why else would you be in the God's Wood? Yes, Loras chimed in, hands on his hips. Aren't you a woodsman? Before Galad could answer, Garland cleared his throat. He's a knight now, remember? Galad turned his smile on Garland. I am at that. But if a woodsman can become a knight, then it follows that a knight can be a woodsman too. I am proof of it, no. Marjorie shot her brother a triumphant look. See? He can be both, dummy. He can just use his sword to chop the wood now. Garland chuckled. You are wise, sister. He inclined his head toward Galad. Forgive my siblings, sire. They were quite excited when they heard you arrived yesterday. Loras nearly cried when you didn't attend the feast. Did not. Loras protested hotly. Just got a hair in my eye. Yes. Galad nodded with exaggerated solemnity. That is very common. Marjorie giggled. Why did you not attend, if I may ask, sire? Garland continued. Our Lord Father wished to honor you before the lords and ladies of the Reach. That made him all the more glad he had not gone. Still, he bowed his head. Please send my apologies to Lord Tyrell, Galad said. Had I known my presence was required, I would not have abstained. It had simply been a long day on the road. I wished for rest more than for good food and company. I was going to let you dance with me, Marjorie said, crossing her arms. But now you can't. Galad felt a genuine smile pull at his lips. I would have risen from the dead, my lady, had I known I would dance with you. I hope you will find it in your heart to forgive me. She sniffed, chin lifting. I shall think on it. Garland glanced past Galad, noting how close he stood to the weirwoods. Were you praying, sire? Forgive the interruption, if so. I hadn't known you kept to the old gods. Not praying, Galad said, gesturing to the book resting atop his folded cloak on a nearby stump. Simply enjoying the quiet. It's been a sudden shift, going from my home to such a lively castle. You don't like it here? Marjorie asked, eyes widening as though on the verge of tears. Her expression tugged at something old and tender in his chest. She reminded him painfully of Elaine when she was a young girl. He wished he could have been a better brother to her and Gayen when they were growing up. That's not what I meant, he said gently. It will simply take time to adjust. But you only just arrived. Loras said. You haven't taught us anything new yet. I want to be a woodsman like you when I grow up. A woodsman knight. So do I. Marjorie echoed. So do I. You can't, Loras said. You're a lady. She huffed. Didn't you hear Sir Galad? If a woodsman can be a knight, then a lady can be a woodsman too. A woodswoman cannot. Galad smiled again and ruffled Loras's hair. I'm not leaving quite yet. How about this, if you two gather enough kindling for me, I'll show you how to start and keep a fire. The children whooped with delight and dashed off at once, gathering sticks by the armful, already arguing over who had found the best and driest ones. Once the children had run far enough away, Garland's expression sobered. "You will join the army when it leaves, then?" he asked. "I will." The answer seemed to steel the boy. Garland drew a breath. "Then, please, sire. Take me with you as your squire." He blinked. "My squire? You will find none who will fulfill a squire's duties more diligently than I," Garland said quickly. "I swear it. I'm 12 already. I know how to clean the rust from plate and mail, how to oil leather and tend to horses. I rise early, I listen well, and if need be..." He swallowed, then lifted his chin. "If need be, I will ride by your side and acquit myself well in battle." Galad studied him for a moment, the boy's face full of earnestness and admiration. He felt a knot tighten in his chest. "My lord," he began, then stopped himself. He exhaled slowly. "Garland." He met the boy's gaze fully. "It would be an honor to have you as my squire. Truly. But I will not take a child to war. No matter how capable he may be." Garland's brow furrowed at once. "Why not? Every knight and lord will take theirs. There is nothing wrong with it." "Perhaps there isn't," Galad allowed. "But did you not hear? I am a simple woodsman from the countryside. I know little of the customs high-born men follow. If taking a 12-year-old squire into battle is tradition, then I will simply not follow it." Garland opened his mouth to argue, but Galad continued before he could. "Besides," he said, "why not squire for your lord father? You can serve as his cup-bearer as well. You would meet important lords, attend and listen in during council meetings, learn the ways of war and the logistics of armies at the very source." It was a reasonable suggestion. A kind one. A high lord like Mace Tyrell may not even see battle in the campaign to come. That might be a safer, and still worthy, experience for a boy his age. Garland's shoulders slumped. His eyes dropped to the ground. Galad watched him and felt the familiar, bitter certainty settle in his chest. He would not move on this. He fully expected to be in the thick of the fighting when the time came. He wanted it that way. If death waited for him on the battlefield, he would meet it head-on. He had done so before and the idea did not scare him. But he would not take a boy with him into a slaughter of his own choosing. "Because..." Garland began after a moment. He hesitated, then forced the words out. "Because if I become his squire now, then I can't squire under you." Understanding dawned. Something inside him softened. "I see," he said. Garland looked up again, hope flickering uncertainly across his face. "Then how about this?" Galad said. "I will accept you as my squire now, but your duties will not begin until I return from war." He raised a hand as the boy's breath caught. "In the meantime, we will train every day. 1 hour at dawn, another at dusk. You will practice footwork, forms, and endurance. And once my armor is ready, you may help me tend to it." Garland beamed. "I accept," he said quickly. Then he paused. "Well, I have to ask my lord father. And he will likely ask my grandmother." His grin returned, unabated. "But I still accept, sire." "Very good, then," Galad said, amused. "Let us start now, before your siblings gather enough sticks to set the entire castle afire." Chapter 9. Later that day, Galad found Ben in a narrow room tucked into one of the castle's quieter wings, far from the noise of the barracks. The ceiling sloped low enough that he had to mind his head as he stepped inside. A small window let in a strip of pale afternoon light, just enough to illuminate the bed, a wash basin and a single chair pulled close to the wall. Ben lay propped against a pile of pillows, bandages wrapped tight around his left thigh. He looked better than Galad had expected, though the restless set of his jaw betrayed how little he enjoyed being confined. 3 more weeks, then, Galad said after a glance at the leg. "That's fast." Ben huffed. "Not fast enough to march with the lot of you." "There will be other wars," Galad said evenly. "There always were." He hesitated, then added, "I had thought you and Lorne were both made knights." He had come here after asking Lorne for directions. Galad had seen Ben briefly after the fighting, when the children returned to the village with his cart and mule they had been taking to Highgarden. And the guard on top of it. The maester in the inn had done the rest. "Nay," Ben said, more sad than bitter. "I was still rewarded, I got me a good purse and better quarters for it." He shifted, then smirked faintly. I'm a sergeant now. You deserve it, Galad said. What you did was brave. Worthy of song. Ben snorted. Not worth a knighthood, though. That was your dream, then. To be a knight? Ben gave him a look. Wasn't it yours? No, Galad thought, and nearly said, as was his habit. He caught himself in time. Yes, he said instead. I suppose so. It would have been a cruelty to deny it now, with the rank already given, speaking to a man who had wanted the same thing and fallen short of it. Ben stared at the ceiling for a moment. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter. It's not. Not my dream, I mean. He frowned, working his jaw. But, there's a woman. A lady. He shook his head, almost laughing at himself. I wouldn't mind being a guardsman my whole life, you hear. But a low-born guard can't exactly go and get himself a lady for a wife, can he? I see, he said. Love, then. A better reason than most. Galad swallowed. He had loved before. Deeply. To the point he didn't know if he ever would again. He almost reached for the oneness as all those old emotions rushed in, but he could not hide behind it forever. Does she return it? He managed to say. Ben barked out a laugh. Sure. A fine lady falling for a castle guard. This isn't a bloody song, Galad. He fell silent, cheeks reddening. His fingers picked at the edge of the blanket. Will you help me? He asked at last. Become a knight. Galad raised an eyebrow. I can make you one, if that is truly what you want. He had heard it said often enough, any knight could make a knight. It would cost him nothing but a few words and the weight of his sword. Ben had earned at least that much in the defense of his home and the children. The man shook his head. That's not it. He grimaced. I can't just be a hedge knight. That's no better than being a man-at-arms, not really. You've got no lance or coin to give me even if you put the sword on my shoulder. He met Galad's eyes. No. I want help being better. Galad considered him in silence. What could he promise? Nothing that depended on the future. He might die in the war. He might leave Highgarden for good. He would not give the man false hope. His gaze dropped to the bandaged leg. I imagine you can't train until you're healed. Ben said sourly. Maester says no strain, no lifting, no yard neither. Then if I return to Highgarden, Galad said, I will help you practice the sword. He did not intend to become a teacher twice in a single day, but Galad had had mentors of his own, men and women who helped him better himself when he needed. He would not deny a man the chance to fulfill his own potential. Ben groaned. That's not what I'm asking. Though fighting like you surely wouldn't hurt. What I'm asking is. He looked embarrassed now, rubbing the back of his neck. I saw them books back in your house. You a lettered man, then? Galad nodded. Then. Ben hesitated, then took a breath. Will you help me learn how to read? I just figured, you know. The lady. She's smart, man, clever as any two maesters put together. Spends half her time in the library, from what I seen. She wouldn't marry a man who can't put two words together proper, yes. The words came out in a rush, as if he feared losing his nerve. I see, Galad said, and smiled. That's commendable, Ben. You must care for her deeply, if you're willing to go this far. Ben shrugged. The previous embarrassment turned into a grin. I'm a romantic at heart. I'll either marry her or die trying. Seems a fair life to me. I'll come by after my time in the yard, Galad said. Every day, until the army departs. We'll start small. Ben's eyes lit up. Truly. Truly. Thank you, Ben said. Really. Galad reached into his satchel. Ready to begin. Ben blinked. Now. Galad pulled out the book he had been carrying and set it on his knee. He dragged the chair closer to the bed and sat. Now, he said. We'll start with the letters. Ben's eyes widened. He stared at the yellowed pages as if they were a battlefield in its own right. Then Galad began to read. XXX. 10 days after Galad arrived in Highgarden, the bells tolled. They rang loud and long across the castle's pale stone towers and over the fields beyond its walls, the sound seeming to ripple across the hills and spill into the town below. Word spread quicker than any rider could carry it. Servants whispered it in corridors, stably boys shouted it across courtyards, and by midday the whole castle thrummed with the news. Lord Stannis Baratheon had smashed the Ironborn fleet off Fair Isle the day before, and the Reach rejoiced as though the war itself had ended in a single afternoon. By nightfall, Highgarden glittered with festivity. Lord Mace Tyrell ordered a banquet for every lord, knight, captain, and guest of sufficient rank. The great hall had been transformed into a living garden of flowers and banners, green and gold roses intertwined with the sigils of House Tyrell's bannermen. Long trestle tables stretched the length of the hall, each covered with fresh linens and crowded with trenchers and silver cups. Lanterns shaped like blooming lilies cast a warm golden glow across polished stone floors, their light reflecting off colorful doublets and silk gowns. Music drifted from a raised dais near the high table, harps, flutes, and fiddles blending into something lively and elegant, a few couples already dancing to the tune. Galad found himself far down one of the tables among the Tyrell household knights and the higher-standing guards, distant enough from the lords on the high table that the faces there blurred together beneath the lights. Ben sat at his side, his walking stick leaning against the bench. He had limped his way into the hall on his own, which was progress. Across the table, Lorne shared the bench with the two young men Galad had first seen training him in the training yard. The food was rich and savory, served with more drink than any man could want. He had eaten a plate of honey-glazed capon served with buttered carrots, roasted onions, and soft white bread dripping with herb sauce. "I knew they saved the good stuff for high feasts," Ben muttered beside him, humming delightedly over his ale mug. Galad nodded and took a sip of his own. Bitter still on the tongue, but it went down easily enough. He had never been much of a drinker. He found himself thinking instead of the sweet Mayonnaise wine Berlane had always favoured. How she always teased him for sitting so stiffly at feasts. He took another pull of the ale. "I can't get enough of the stuff," one of the young men next to Lorne said loudly. "Bet you a penny I can finish my flagon for you," the other replied. They grinned at each other with reckless enthusiasm. Micah and Mors, Galad had learned, brothers from the same mother but different fathers, and thick as thieves despite it. Lorne had married the woman a few years back and taken the boys under his wing. Now a knight, the brothers served almost as his squires despite their age, though Lorne himself refused to call them that. Lorne reached out and rapped them both on the ear. "Enough drinking," he grunted. "With the Iron Fleet sunk, we might march off tomorrow already. I don't want you face down in the mud come morning. Isn't that even more reason to get pissed drunk?" Micah shot back. "I'll cheers to that," Mors said, raising his cup. Lorne huffed and shook his head. Ben did not raise his glass, sulking quietly. He was still sour that his injury kept him from joining the coming campaign in the islands. The brothers continued their back and forth, and Galad let their chatter fade into the background. Since arriving at Highgarden, his days had fallen into a steady rhythm. He'd train with Garland at dawn and with Lorne and the other guards later in the morning. After eating, he helped Ben with his reading before going straight to the library to devour anything he could find. At dusk, he split his time between drilling his unofficial squire and entertaining his younger siblings who insisted on joining Garland in the God's Wood. He had discovered that he enjoyed teaching more than he expected. Whether it was fighting or reading or sparking a campfire, there was satisfaction in seeing understanding dawn in another's eyes. Yet despite the pleasant routine, he felt restless. Highgarden's beauty was suffocating when filled with so many people. He almost felt eager for the war to come, which left him conflicted. He knew the ugliness of it better than most, but he could not help remembering the scenes back in the village. The light itself demanded justice for such acts. He wiped his hands on a cloth and considered retiring early. Better to be rested if orders came with the dawn. Before he could rise, the men across from him suddenly half stood and bowed their heads. Galad turned, confused, just as someone tapped his shoulder. He looked down to see little Marjorie Tyrell standing in front of him, hands tucked behind her back, forest green skirts swaying shyly from side to side. "I would allow you to dance with me tonight, Sir Galad," she said, as if she were granting him a great favor. Ignoring the raised eyebrows around the table, he placed his cup down carefully, then rose from his seat. He took one of her tiny hands in his and bowed with all due formality. "Lady Marjorie," he said, "would you care to dance with this lowly knight?" The girl grinned brightly, chin lifting with an earnest seriousness that did not quite mask her excitement. "If you insist, sire," she said. Before Galad could offer another word, she had taken his hand in both of hers and was already tugging him forward. She pulled him across the hall toward the open space before the high table, where couples from the Reach moved in orderly lines and circles. She stopped just short of the dancers and turned to face him. "Are you a good dancer, sir?" "I will not embarrass you, if that's your fear," he told her. She giggled at that, clearly pleased. "You can't embarrass me, silly. You would be embarrassing yourself." Then she tugged him forward again, pulling him into the line of dancers as the musicians struck up the next refrain. The steps were simple enough. Galad followed them without trouble. He had attended enough feasts and balls across the Westlands to recognize the pattern quickly. Marjorie watched him closely at first, as if waiting for him to falter, but when he did not, her attention drifted back to the dance itself, laughing with joy as he spun her until her feet left the ground. Around them, the nobility of the Reach danced on, older couples moving with practiced ease, younger ones with varying degrees of success. Galad was aware of the attention they drew. Not because of himself, but because of who she was. A Tyrell daughter dancing with a knight not long arrived at Highgarden invited notice, and he felt more than a few eyes on his back. When the song ended, Marjorie's cheeks were flushed, more from laughter than exertion. She released his hands and dropped into a careful curtsy, clearly proud of herself. Galad returned it with a respectful bow. "Well done, my lady," he said. "You kept the steps better than most." She beamed. "I know," she said, then caught his hand again before he could step away. "Come with me. My cousin wants to dance with you as well." Galad hesitated only a moment before allowing himself to be led. It was hard to refuse when she looked at him with those big doe eyes. She pulled him quickly toward the edge of the floor, then stopped right in front of a familiar face. Galad recognized her at once, the young woman he had met his first day in Highgarden, in the God's Wood. He kept his expression neutral, though inwardly he grimaced. He had no desire to draw attention from that woman ever again. Still, she looked different this time. Not in dress, as she wore Tyrell green and gold as before, but in bearing. Her posture was straighter, her gaze more measured. Brown eyes followed him as he approached, sharper than he remembered. "Taria, this is Sir Galad of Dustinbury," Marjorie announced proudly. "He is special, since he is both a knight and a woodsman. Willis says he is the best swordsman he's ever seen, and he is the best woodsman I've ever seen, so really he is the best." Victoria Tyrell smiled at her cousin's enthusiasm. "Is that so?" she said, eyes flicking to Galad. "I hope he is the best dancer as well." "He is," Marjorie insisted. Victoria raised an eyebrow at that, clearly amused, and Galad inclined his head. "Would you care for a dance, Lady Victoria?" He figured he might as well take the lead of the situation since it came to this. She accepted his hand without hesitation. Marjorie waved at them as they moved away, already turning her attention back toward the edge of the floor and whatever had caught her eye next. The bards began a new song as Galad and Victoria joined the dancers. This one was slower, and they moved through the opening steps in silence, her hand resting lightly in his. "I hope you will forgive me for last week, sir," Victoria said after a moment. Her voice was low, but nothing like the breathy tone she had used before. Galad kept his attention on the dance, his posture relaxed but alert. "Nothing happened," he said evenly. "Thus there is nothing to forgive." She nodded once. "I am glad, then." They danced on for several steps before she spoke again. "My little cousins have spoken of you often," she said. "They are quite taken with you." "I am glad they find me agreeable," Galad replied. "And if you were to spend time around them," she continued, a concerned older cousin might have wanted to take the measure of the man behind the stories. Galad considered that as they turned. "And what did you learn?" "That given the opportunity," she said, "you would not take advantage of a vulnerable young woman in a secluded wood." So that was it. A test, then. He did not know whether to find it insulting or sensible. "That is not much of an achievement," he said after a moment. "I would think." She smiled faintly. "You would be surprised, sir." Her gaze drifted past him, scanning the hall. "Marjorie was right, you are a good dancer. I have found few suitable partners of late, and I would not see that few diminished even further." She paused, then added, "You should know that you have made enemies in the yard, sir, and few friends." "Few friends of import, that is." Galad frowned. "I do not recall making enemies." He quickly went over his time in Highgarden. Could she be speaking of the Inchfield knight from his first day in the castle? He could not see how he had done anything other than spar with the man. Unless the knight saw his own slipping as Galad's fault. A ridiculous idea, but many men had strange notions when their ego came into question. The music slowed, signaling the end of the dance. Victoria stepped back and curtsied. I have said my piece, sire. I wish you good fortune in the war to come. Then she turned and left him standing there, alone in the middle of the floor. Galad watched her go for a moment before exhaling quietly. He had not sought notice, yet it seemed to find him all the same. He began to move toward the edge of the hall, but he had taken only a few steps when Lord Mace Tyrell rose from his seat on the dais. The hall gradually stilled as his presence drew attention, voices fading as servants and nobles alike turned to face him. Galad halted to hear him. My lords, Mace called, spreading his hands wide. My ladies. The last murmurs fell away. Yesterday, the Seven Kingdoms won a great victory over the scourge of the Ironborn, he continued. With the might of the Arbor's finest at his back, Lord Stannis Baratheon struck a blow that will be remembered. Cheers of approval spread through the hall. But our work is not done, Mace went on. It will not be done until every longship lies broken, until we have set foot on every island, until every pirate lord has been torn from his seat. He paused, letting the words settle. We have answered the Crown's call and raised a mighty army to join this campaign. Today, I received our orders from the Iron Throne. The armies of the Reach will be responsible for subduing Orkmont, Blacktide, and Harlaw. Had the king asked, we would have taken every island ourselves from Pike to Great Wick and even Lonely Light, but we will make do. Laughter rippled through the tables at that. He waited for the amusement to pass before continuing. As we have 3 islands under our charge, we will divide our strength accordingly. Lord Randall Tarley will lead the force against Orkmont, with the spears of Florent, Fossoway, and Merryweather at his back. Lord Mathis Rowan will command the invasion of Blacktide, leading men from Hightower, Caswell, Huey, and Meadows. Mace's chest lifted with pride. And I, Mace Tyrell, Lord of Highgarden, Lord Paramount of the Manor, Defender of the Marches, High Marshal of the Reach, and Warden of the South, will personally lead the Tyrell banners to Harlaw. More cheer rose up, ringing across the walls. Prepare yourselves, my lords, he said. Kiss your wives hungrily tonight. Hold your children close. On the morrow, we depart for Old Town, and from there to the Iron Islands. He raised his cup. To war. Chapter 10. The oars of the boat dipped and rose, each stroke pulling them closer to the shoreline. Galad sat near the prow with his shield across his knees and his armor bundled in cloth at his feet, and watched the island grow in the pale early light. Behind them, the fleet rode at anchor in the swell. The ships looked smaller already, their hulls dark against the water, the dawn catching the tops of their masts in red and pale gold. The hunter of Old Town sat heavy amongst them, the ship that had brought him here. Sir Willem Withers, the knight Galad would serve under during the campaign, would be joining them in the first wave into the island, while Lord Mace and the other knights and lordlings of higher station would come after they had established a beachhead. Around them, the dinghies spread out across the water in long uneven rows, dozens upon dozens of them, each loaded with men and gear. The sound of oars was everywhere, wood creaking, water slapping at the hulls. Someone in a nearby boat coughed. Someone else muttered something Galad couldn't make out, and was hushed. He turned his attention back to the shore. The beach was wide and open in front of them, a pale grey strip against the darker mass of the island. That much was good. To the west, though, tall cliffs and ridges pressed down to the very edge of the water, cutting off any view of what lay beyond them. To the north and east, the land beyond the sandy beach lifted into low rolling hills that stretched on into the distance. Low, but not so low a man could not lose himself behind them. Not so low you could be sure of what lay on the other side. We should have sent scouts ahead, Galad said. I don't like the look of those hills. Beside him, Lorne followed his gaze without speaking for a moment. Then he gave a short nod. You can hide a company of men behind them. He huffed through his nose. And the cliffs. He did not finish the thought. He didn't need to. Doesn't matter. Neryl's voice came from further back in the boat. The older man-at-arms had his arms crossed over his chest, his expression the particular blankness of a man who had stopped expecting things to be done properly. Heard Sir Willem saying Lord Mace is scrambling now. We got word of Sir Barristan already landing at Great Wick. And Lord Tarley's already taken the first stronghold on Orkmont. He tilted his head. House Tyrell cannot be seen dallying, what he said. Lorne grunted. Galad said nothing more either. He was already on the boat. They all were. Words wouldn't alter the shape of what was coming. He turned and looked at the men behind him. Aside from the sailors crewing the boat, there were 8 of them in all, including himself and Lorne, the only 2 who were knights. The 6 men at arms sat in pairs along the benches, their packs wedged between their feet. Micah caught his eye and gave him a slight raise of his chin and an easy smile. His half-brother Mors sat beside him, one hand gripping the haft of the mace on his belt, fingers opening and closing around the leather wrapping. His jaw was set. His face had gone a pale, yellowish color in the grey morning light. It would be his first battle, Galad realized. His own first battle sat decades behind him, though if anyone asked, he'd have to say it had come only 2 moons ago. Even back then, he had been able to push the pre-battle fear down, to feed it into the flame in the void until it was gone. Fear was a distraction, Gareth had taught him, and distractions got you killed as much as love and hate and all the great emotions that moved men. Now, going into battle didn't scare him at all. If anything, he felt the pull of it, a quiet and unsentimental eagerness to do something that mattered. To act with purpose in this new world he found himself in, to lay some measure of justice down on behalf of the men and women of his little village. Mors looked up and caught him watching. His expression shifted into a scowl. "I'm fine," he said, but his face had gone from pale to actively green. His eyes widened for only a second before he lurched sideways over the gunwale and was sick, most of it catching the water but a good portion splashing down the blade of an oar held by one of the sailors. The sailor pulled his oar in and stared at it, then at Mors. "Want to bugger me with it too while you're at it?" Mors mumbled something that might have been an apology. Micah covered his mouth, shoulders shaking. "Give him a break, he's just nervous about his first battle." "Not nervous," Mors said, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. "Just haven't got me sea legs yet." "Oh, screw off." Micah grinned. "You were fine the whole trip over. Just admit." "Enough." Lorne's voice was flat. The brothers went quiet. "No more jokes. We're at war now." Galad was already looking at the beach as it slowly got closer and closer, until they were close enough the sailors rowing them in called out. They lifted the oars clear of the water, and as the boat ground forward on the sand, men began going over the sides without waiting to be told. He followed suit, the water hitting him mid-thigh and the cold of it snapping through him like a blow. He hadn't expected it, but he did the only thing a soldier could do, gritting his teeth, tucking his pack higher against his back, and pushing forward, boots finding uneven purchase on the sand below. All around him, knights and men at arms were doing the same, dropping into the water and wading in, the surface breaking and churning wide around their legs. More boats were coming in behind them, dozens of them, with men pouring over the sides into the shallows in long staggered lines even as the first boats were already rowing back toward the ships. Beside him, Mors went down to one knee as his footing gave. He almost dropped his pack before Galad caught him under the arm and hauled him up. Lorne took the other side, and together they kept him moving until the water dropped to his ankles and then to nothing, and they stepped up onto wet sand. "Wet boots," Neril said from ahead of them, stepping clear of the tide line. "Great way to start a campaign, that." A few men around him gave a ragged laugh. Galad couldn't help a small smile as well. War was a nasty thing, but there was a brotherhood that could only be born of that shared struggle that he had missed from his past life. Wet and already getting cold in the early morning chill, his first steps on dry sand felt like relief. Ahead of them, the beach sloped upward, gradual at first and then more steeply, until the pale sand gave way to dry, patchy grass at the berm. He was one of the first men fully out of the water across the stretch of shore. Behind him, more soldiers came streaming up from the boats, an uneven tide of men and equipment, some already bent over with their hands on their knees, breathing hard as if they'd waded through a battlefield and not a few feet of water. Others, wiser, were already shaking the water from their hands and reaching for their armor. Working quickly, Galad began pulling his own mail hauberk over his head first, then the rest, with Mors moved around behind him without being asked and began working the buckles on his chest piece. The young man was still breathing too fast but he managed to keep his hands steady enough to tie off the plate. To his left, Micah was doing the same for Lorne, who stood still as a post. He was halfway through fastening the last of it when something at the corner of his eye made him stop. He turned and looked. Nothing moved. The beach stretched out in both directions. The tide line ran above them, that dark wet stripe where the water came at high mark. The berm beyond it was thick with flotsam, broken planks and scraps of rope and tattered sailcloth heaped in long wind-blown piles. Beyond the berm, the grass began, dry and patchy, scattered with clumps and irregularities in the ground. He frowned. Was he growing crazy or did the clumps look wrong? The earth too dark, as if freshly dug. "Where's Sir Willem?" he asked. He heard shrugs more than he saw them. Neril tilted his head back toward the water. "Old Coot's probably taking a piss somewhere in the shallows." A few men laughed. "We need a scouting party up that slope now," Galad said. The words came out quieter than he intended. His eyes had not left the berm. "See something?" Lorne said, moving to his shoulder. The hairs along the back of his neck rose. Before he reached inward for the oneness, one of the piles of sailcloth moved. His eyes widened. "Shields." The word tore out of him. He had his own up before the echo finished. "Shields up! Shields up!" For one frozen moment the beach was still. Then the berm erupted. Men came up out of the ground like the dead rising. Tarps and sailcloth thrown back, the loose sand piled above them scattering. Others kicked up from shallow pits beneath the clumps in the earth, or stood from behind piled driftwood, or simply rose from where they had lain flat behind the dry grass. Ironborn, 50 or 60 of them spread along the ridge of the berm, and every man among them was holding a bow. Galad heard the first shaft cut the air above him and dropped to one knee, shield braced forward and angled up. The arrow struck the wood with a hard crack and stood there, quivering. Then the volley came in full and the world became noise. The low hiss and whistle of arrows in the air and the sharp smack of them striking wood and dull against sand and the wet sounds of them striking men. Screams came fast on the heels of the first volleys, ragged and sharp and some of them cut off. He heard the sound next to him. A meatier impact than wood. He looked. Micah had fallen. He was on his back in the sand a foot from Galad's knee, one hand reaching for nothing, an arrow shaft through his throat. His eyes were open and very wide, staring up as if confused about his situation. His mouth opened and closed as if trying to speak, blood running from it freely, and his fingers dug once into the wet sand and went still. A scream. Mors went down beside his brother before Galad could stop him, dropping his shield and pressing both hands against the wound as if the pressure could matter now. He was shaking so hard his teeth chattered, saying something wordless and broken under his breath. Without thinking, Galad moved, got his arm under Mors's and wrenched him sideways, putting the shield between the boy and the berm. Lorne came in from the other side, shield raised, and together they pushed Mors back and kept him moving until he was behind the bulk of their group. Arrows came down around them, one striking the sand between Galad's feet as they moved. "They'll kill us one by one if we stay here," Galad said, loud enough for the men around them to hear. Lorne looked back toward Micah's body. Something moved in his face and quickly locked away. He reached down, picked up the shield that had been sitting on Micah's gear bag, and pressed it into the Moor's hands. "Honor thy brother," he said. Then he straightened and drew his sword, pointing it high in the air. "With me." Stepping forward, he broke into a run, heading straight up the slope of the beach toward the berm. "High Garden! High Garden!" Galad went after him. There was no decision to it. The only way out from under an arrow storm was through the men drawing the bows, and Lorne was already 5 yards ahead of him and picking up speed. Bringing his shield up at an angle, he covered his face and chest and simply ran. The arrows came down in staggered waves. Sand kicked up around his boots and he heard the close hiss of a shaft going by his ear. To his left, a man stumbled and went down. To his right, another man was running with a shaft through his shoulder and hadn't slowed. Behind him, voices picked up the call, yelling "High Garden!" and "Tyrell," and when he glanced back there were men all down the line scrambling to their feet and running after them, some brave or stupid enough to do so without their shields. The berm came up fast. The iron-born bowmen had been pulling arrows as quickly as they could draw, but they were only men, and some of them were already turning to run as they saw the line coming up the slope. Somewhere behind the berm, came the sound of a short, sharp horn, just as Galad reached the end of the beach. Vaulting over a heap of rotting timber, he came down on patchy grass, a bowman directly ahead of him scrambling to draw another arrow. Galad closed the gap in 3 long strides and struck a simple swing. A head rolled sideways, but he was already moving again, as another archer turned on him, swinging his bow like a club. Parrying it easily, a low Fane saw him punching through the man's guard and putting the point of his blade into his throat. Like a mummer in a play, the man sat down slowly in the grass, folding over himself until he lay with his bottoms up and his head half buried in the grass. A few feet away, Lorne's sword was red, and all along the ridgeline, men of the Reach crested in a ragged wave, shouting, some of them dropping to their knees to retrieve the iron-borne bows before the bodies were even cold. Galad watched a man pull an arrow from a dead man's quiver and knock it with clumsy, furious hands, shooting at the retreating archers' backs and missing wildly. The remaining iron-borne fled in a hard, desperate run through the grassy passes between the hills, while the stragglers were cut down mercilessly by the Reachmen. A cheer went up along the berm. Long and ragged and very loud. "Serves the fuckers right," Neril said, breathing hard, wiping blood from his hand onto his trousers. To his left, Mors knelt in the grass above a dead iron-borne man, a dagger in his fist, driving it down again and again. The man had been dead some time, but Mors did not seem to notice or care, snarling incomprehensible words with a face wet with tears. Lorne stepped over to him and got a hand under his arm. "Enough, boy," he said, not unkindly. He pulled him back and up to his feet. "It ain't over." He looked at Galad. "Something ain't right." Raising his gaze, Galad looked out toward the passes and the retreating ironmen. He frowned. "No," he said. "It was too clean. A company of archers in a retreat, that was no finishing stroke. Whoever had planned this, and they had planned it, would not have set it up only to fall back at the first charge. The archers had done their work, killed men at the water line, spread panic on the beach. The question was what came next. He closed his eyes for a moment and reached inward. Everything that was not the present, the moment, the people and the world around him, he fed to the flame one piece at a time, and he let it burn until there was nothing left but stillness. The void opened around him like a held breath. In it, he could hear the cheering very clearly, individual voices separating out from the noise. The last sounds of fighting dying away to the west. The wind off the sea. The grass moving. And beneath his boots, very faint but steady, the grains of sand vibrating with a slight tremor in the earth. He opened his eyes. "Horses," he said. Neril went rigid. "Shit. Form up." Lorne bellowed, turning on the celebrating men around them. "Form up on me, you whoresons. Now." They had only just begun to cluster together when the riders came around the base of the western cliffs at a full gallop. Some 36 of them, coming hard along the water line. They flew a half-familiar banner, one quartered with the scythe of Harlaw and a peacock upon a beige field, and they did not come up the slope toward the berm. Instead, they swept directly across the beach below. The men still in the shallows, the men who had not run up the slope, the men sitting in the wet sand too tired to move, the scattered groups still waiting in from the last boats. These men the riders went through like a blade through cloth, hacking down from their mounts as they passed, spearing through with short lances, mauling with maces and clubs. Galad watched from the berm and could do nothing. Too far away, too scattered. Some men dove clear. Others ran, diving back into the water. Most did not get up. "Cowards," Mors cried out beside him, eyes red and burning. The horn sounded again, 2 short notes, and the riders did not press all the way across the beach. With a discipline that surprised Galad given what he knew of the Ironborn, they wheeled as one body and veered up the sand. They struck a smaller clump of Reachmen who had not reached the berm, men scattering in every direction, and then they were past and running, following the archers into the same passes in the hills, the drumming of their hooves fading into the grass. Somewhere to his right, a red and white lifted above a crowd of soldiers, a grey squirrel on its face. Men pressed toward it, voices rising. "Sir Willem Arms!" called a young man that had joined the cluster around Lorne, a comely fellow with mud on his face who had been one of the first over the berm with them. His voice carried over the beach. The banner dipped once and then swung forward, pointing toward the hills. A trumpet sounded from the group beneath it, and then that mass of men around the banner began to run toward the passes. The call spread down the line like fire in dry grass. "Follow your commander. For the Reach. Tyrell! Tyrell!" Men who had been standing and breathing turned and ran. Men who had just made it up the berm turned and ran. Within moments the berm was emptying, with hundreds of men charging after a cavalry force they had watched disappear into broken ground they had never set eyes on. His mind whirling, Galad stood and watched it. The passes were narrow. The ground was unknown. The men were barely formed, barely armored, and winded from the water and the run up the beach. A cavalry force that knew the terrain could do to them in those passes what the archers had done here, draw them in and cut them apart. That was the point of it. How could Sir Willem not see it? From the archers to the riders to the retreat, every piece of it designed to pull them off the beach and into a killing ground of Harlaw's choosing. They should hold the beach. Wait for the second wave. Consolidate their hold on the beach instead of chasing men into hills they'd never seen. Around him, the small clump of men had not moved. Lorne. Neril. Moors, still red-eyed. A dozen others, drawn to them from other boats. Lorne looked at him. Galad let out a slow breath. He was not the commander here. He was a knight from a village with no lands and no name worth speaking of, and none of these men were his to order. Sir Willem had given a direction. The army was moving. You heard the orders, he said. At times, discipline in an army was more important than sound tactics. Sheathing his sword, he broke the arrow sticking on his shield and went after the bulk of the Reach forces. Chapter 11. Sir Aerys Oakhart. Hesitating, Aerys looked toward the older man for orders, a lean veteran with a weathered face, the one who had called the charge against the archers. The older knight faltered too, and he did not look at the charging Sir Willem. For some reason, his eyes were on a younger man at his shoulder, dark-haired, taller than most, and with violet eyes that didn't belong on any face Aerys had seen outside of paintings. Odd, that an older knight would look to someone younger, but the violet-eyed knight simply drew a breath, said something about orders, and went after the banner. The men around him followed without being asked. So Aerys went with them. Around and in front of him, the Reachmen ran, shouting names and oaths into the chilly wind, and he ran with them because standing still would have been worse. Charging after cavalry into unknown hills was the kind of order that got men killed. Aerys knew it. The violet-eyed knight and the veteran seemed to know it too. But standing still meant dishonor. Meant accusations of cowardice. And he could not have that. His lady mother would call this foolishness. She would be right, probably. She was usually right, which was the most irritating thing about her. Ahead, Sir Willem's squirrel banner caught the morning light, moving fast toward the mouth of the pass. The land narrowed there, the hills pressing in close on either side, the grass giving way to rougher ground. Aerys watched the last of the iron-born cavalry disappear between the slopes and felt something cold settle into his chest. They were being pulled. He could feel it in the same way he sometimes felt a wrong step beneath him in the yard before his foot had fully landed. But stopping was its own kind of failure. He had left Old Oak without his lady mother's blessing, without her men, without anything except his horse and his armor and a name that meant precisely nothing to Lord Mace Tyrell or anyone else for that matter. With Lady Erwin Oakhart, disobedience had its price. He knew that better than most. She would do everything short of disowning him for this, and he needed something to show for it. XXX. The pass opened into a shallow bowl between the hills, and the Ironborn were waiting at the far end of it. They came out in an organized file from behind the rise. They walked out in close order and stopped, and by the time the Reachmen had spread themselves across the mouth of the bowl, there was a line of Ironborn infantry already formed up with the slope at their backs. Better armed than the archers at the beach, properly armored most of them, shields locked and weapons out. More of them than the Reachmen, though not overwhelmingly so. Perhaps half again their number. Sir Willem's trumpeter called the halt. His banner planted itself in the center as the Reachmen formed up in a rough two-deep line, dressed across the width of the bowl. Something hot and immediate moved through Aerys's chest. This was what he had come for, not the chaos of the beach or shivering inside a wet dinghy. An army facing an army. A line of men against a line of men, and room enough to do something worthy of note. His mother would hear of it eventually. They all would. He would bring honor to House Oakhart. He would make himself a name that traveled, that climbed, that reached the ears of the right people at the right moments. King Robert filled his court with men he admired. Men who had done things. A knight who distinguished himself here, today, on an island no one had wanted to fight for, might find a white cloak waiting for him at the end of it. Maidens would weep when he donned it. Bards would set the weeping to music, and his wastrel brothers would hear the songs and know exactly what he thought of their example. Aerys grinned to himself as the line settled, men pressing shields together, finding their footing in the grass. He and the group he had attached himself to ended up in the second rank, left of center. Too far back. He wanted to be in the front of it, where the fighting would be thickest, but pushing through men-at-arms and levies to claim a spot that wasn't his would make him look green and desperate rather than eager. He stayed where he was. This is folly, the violet-eyed knight said beside him. Aerys looked at him. The man was watching the Ironborn line settle, jaw set, not afraid exactly, but not smiling either. Afraid of some iron-born scum, sir. The words came out more sharply than he intended, but he didn't soften them. A single reachman is worth 5 of these rocks and salt savages. I fear only the obvious. The man's voice was even. Their cavalry wheeled off and disappeared. Infantry pins us here, then their riders come back and take our flank. Ares opened his mouth. Closed it again. He was glad he didn't have much time to think on it, as soon the iron-born line came forward at a walk, then broke into a run over the last 20 yards. The sound of them hitting the reachman line was like timber coming down, a massive cracking impact that rolled all the way to the second rank. He felt it through the man in front of him as the man's back pressed against his shield, weight coming through suddenly and hard. Ares planted his feet and shoved back. He got his sword up over the man's shoulder, angled in like a spear, searching for the gap between gorget and helmet, and found it. The ironborn seized. 2 more took the space before the body had fully dropped to the ground. When he tried the same angle again, he caught the flat of the man-at-arms' own blade instead, the swords ringing hard against each other. The ironborn in front of them nearly got his axe through the scramble. Watch it, fool! The man-at-arms turned half around, face red, eyes wide. Mouth suddenly dry, Ares pulled his sword back, swallowing. He almost got the man killed. He watched the line after that rather than forcing his own openings, waiting, letting the rhythm of it come to him. Further along, the ironborn found a weak spot and began to push through, and Ares's heart lurched, but then Sir Willem came up from behind the center with his household knights and plugged it, and the line steadied. Then the horn came on the far side of the bowl. 3 short notes. There, the violet-eyed man said, pointing. Ares turned and saw them. The ironborn cavalry had come around from behind the western hill, and they were angling in a wide arc that would bring them down onto the left end of the reachman line. 30-odd riders moving at a gathered canter. They'll smash our left flank, Ares heard himself say. A hand closed on his surcoat and he was moving before he had decided to move, the violet-eyed knight pulling him and the men nearest to them out of the second rank and turning them toward the open ground to the left. Other men came, pulled, or following, a ragged group of perhaps 12 pulling clear of the line and running at an angle toward the approaching horses. His body understood it before his mind did. Running. Ares would have called it cowardice to run from a battle had they not been running straight toward the enemy cavalry. They stopped on the leftmost edge of the line, spreading themselves in a thin curve to cover the flank, and Ares looked at the horses coming and felt the weight of his own body as he had never quite felt it before. The ground through the solace of his boots. The inside of his throat. The particular heaviness of his sword arm. You want to stop a cavalry charge with no pikes? An older man-at-arms said. Not even spears. We hold, or the line collapses, the violet-eyed knight said. The lean veteran gave a single nod. Hold or die. Beside him, the younger man-at-arms, the one with the red eyes from the beach, said nothing. Just set his feet. Ares had trained the charge 100 times at Old Oak, always on horseback, always the one coming forward. He had imagined what it might feel like to be on the other side of it in the abstract way boys imagine things they haven't experienced. The abstract and the real were nothing alike. The horses were already large and growing larger, the sound of them building through the ground beneath him, and his legs felt strange, joints slightly wrong. He kept his feet planted. He would not be the one who ran. Reaching down, the violet-eyed knight drew his blade across the grass in a clean line. They shall not pass this mark. Something moved through the group, straightening spines, tightening jaws. Ares felt it in his own chest, a sudden clarity that came up under the fear like a hand lifting a drowning man. He gripped his sword. Raised his shield. Watched the horses come. 50 yards. Hold, the man said. 30. Hold. They hit. Faster than he expected. Not all of them, though. Several riders saw the line hold and veered at the last moment, splitting off toward the beach, the Harlaw-quartered banners moving with them. But most came on, and the ones who came on found that horses, for all their size and speed, did not willingly run into a wall of men who didn't move. The front riders hauled at their reins and the animals reared or stumbled, and the men coming behind piled into them, and suddenly there were horses going down and men being thrown and the whole front of the charge was a mess of screaming animals and cursing riders. Only one man in their line broke, scrambling back on the grass in hands and knees, but the rest held. The riders who kept their seats came at them from horseback, hacking down. Steel rang and rang. One horseman angled straight at Ares, sword coming around in a flat arc, and he ducked under it and cut at the leg below the stirrup as the animal stepped past. The man swore and twisted, and his horse shifted under him, and when he tried to recover, Ares was already inside his guard. The animal rode away with a dead man atop its saddle. The Ironborn behind the front lines, the ones that managed to stop in time, chose to dismount and came at them on foot. Two of them found Ares at the same moment. The first came with an axe, short-hafted and quick, and Ares caught it on his shield and felt the impact travel up through his shoulder. The second was circling to his right, looking for an angle. He couldn't watch both of them properly. As he turned to keep the circling man in front of him, the axeman immediately swung again, catching him across the back of the shield, and the force of it staggered him sideways. He cut at the circling man's sword arm to buy himself space, didn't connect cleanly, and then the axe was coming again and he had to get the shield back up. His breath came quick and sharp as he fought, and he stopped thinking in words. His body took over, parrying, shifting his feet, getting the shield where it needed to be, cutting whenever a gap opened. He scored a slice above a vambrace, but then an axe blade skidded off the edge of his shield and caught him at the hip, finding the gap between the lower plate and the tacet. The pain came sharp and sudden and his leg buckled under him for a half step. In that half step, the second man's mace was already moving. In an instant, the violet-eyed knight's sword came across from the side and caught the mace's head with a crack, deflecting it past Ares's ear close enough that he felt the displaced air. Ares' leg wobbled and his knee hit the grass. From that angle, low and looking up, he saw it clearly. The violet-eyed knight let his shield drop. Both hands found the grip of his longsword, and suddenly the man stepped into the press of Ironborn around him. His blade began to move. Not wildly. Never wildly. Each cut found its mark and transitioned into the next without pause, his feet carrying him through the gaps between men the way water finds its way between stones, spinning and shifting between them, weaving a tapestry of red in their midst. An Ironborn raised his axe and was dead before it fell. Another tried to close and found the point of a sword already waiting where his neck would be. A third got his shield up in time and took the blade across his sword arm instead, and the sword was already past him and moving on. 6 men. Perhaps more. Ares lost count. He watched mesmerized, the way a child looked at a knight for the first time. By the time he got back to his feet, most of them were down, and the horn was sounding again from somewhere near the hills. The riders who could gather horses wheeled and fled, and the ones who couldn't ran after them. Turning, his leg still unstable beneath him, he saw the Ironborn infantry further up the bowl as it began to pull back. This time, Sir William did not order a charge after them, though Ares thought this might have been the one time such a call would be in the right. Still, the cheering came up all across the bowl and back along the beach. Men shouting and shoving weapons into the air. Ares allowed himself a breath of relief. The cut on his hip was making itself known now, not just a weakness in the leg, but a thin hot line of pain that pulsed with his heartbeat. He had not felt it properly until just now. With some effort, he pushed to his feet, turning toward the men who held the flanks with him. He wished to share the glory with them, perhaps even thank the violet-eyed knight that saved him. He found the man was standing still a few feet away, looking down at the ground. Ares hobbled over and stopped. The older knight lay in the grass. His neck was wrong, the angle of it, and his eyes were open and looking at nothing. Took a hoof to the head, likely. Beside him, the young man-at-arms who had been at his side all morning was kneeling with his hands in his lap and his face empty in the way of a man who had not yet made sense of all that had happened. What was his name? Ares asked. The violet-eyed knight looked up at him. He seemed to study him in a manner that made Ares feel briefly transparent. Lorne, he said. Sir Lorne of Highgarden. Then he knelt on the far side of the body and reached over and closed the man's eyes, and when he spoke his voice was low enough that Ares almost missed it beneath the noise of men celebrating across the hillside. The light shine upon you, my friend. May you shelter in the palm of the Creator's hand, and may the last embrace of the Mother welcome you home. Ares had heard many prayers. He had said most of them himself at one point or another, by the altars of the 7 in the September at Old Oak. He had never heard words like those, and he could not have said what God they were meant for. But he did not mislike them. They felt right. Bowing his head, he spoke the warrior's prayer under his breath, the version his father had taught him before he fell ill and could barely speak or make sense, because the man lying in the grass deserved that much from a stranger. Few would know of his bravery today, but Sir Ares Oakheart would not forget it. Chapter 12. Interlude, Jonaran. Entering the royal apartments, Jon Arryn found the king exactly where he feared, slouched on the edge of his bed with a wineskin at his side. His shoulders slackened at the sight. It hurt no less now to see Robert like this than any of the many times before. "The army is ready to move out, Your Grace." Jon kept his voice even. It echoed in the still chamber. "It waits only for its king." Light from the narrow sea spilled through tall windows, catching the dust motes that danced in the stagnant air. It seemed more a sick room than that of a young conqueror king. Robert didn't look up. His fingers worked at the stopper on the wineskin, twisting it absently. He was dressed for riding immaculately so, the black leather and gold trim fitted perfectly, his boots polished to a shine, but he looked a shell of a man compared to the last time Jon had seen Robert riding out for war. Pale. 2 stone lighter than he'd been all those years ago. His eyes glassy and unfocused. "Any other lords answered?" Robert asked. The question hung in the air between them. Jon's expression softened. He knew what Robert meant without him having to say it. "Lord Umber will lead the northern forces," Jon said. Robert gave a brittle laugh. The sound was hollow, empty of any real humor. "I see." He lifted the wineskin, took a pull, then lowered it again. What was the excuse this time? Catelyn's pregnant with another child? Summer snows blocking travel? His voice rose, taking on an edge. Wildlings attacking the wall. Jon sighed. "Robert." Robert waved him away and stood, the movement stiff. "I do not doubt Ned's loyalty, Jon. Not now and not ever. But this is war. Another war. I had thought." He trailed off, his jaw working. "You thought it would be like before," Jon finished for him. He stepped closer, hands clasped behind his back. "I wished so too, Your Grace. More than you could know." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "But while the rebellion was hard for all who fought in it, it was hardest for Eddard." That much was true. Eddard Stark had not even returned to King's Landing for Robert's coronation. Not after finding his sister dead in that tower in Dorne. He'd taken a ship from Starfall and sailed straight back to the north, so consumed by grief he hadn't even stopped at Riverrun to collect his new bride. He'd sent a small escort to retrieve the Lady Catelyn only after he'd already arrived back in Winterfell. "I know that," Robert said. Annoyance crept into his voice, though even that seemed a weak thing. Muted. Like everything else about him these days. How many years had it been since Jon had seen the king's passions truly rise? He had not thought much of it at first. When the tourneys died down some years ago, Jon had assumed Robert had simply grown weary of the pageantry. When the king stopped going out on hunts, Jon thought he'd grown tired of spending days in the woods instead of his luxurious chambers in the Red Keep. He had not truly worried until the horse stopped showing up at the king's rooms. That had been the clearest sign something was deeply wrong. Robert Baratheon, who had bedded half the tavern girls in the Vale before he was 8 and 10, who had boasted in between battles of finally making the 8, that Robert would never have turned away from women willingly. Jon had tried speaking to him about it, only to be rebuked. He'd gone to Grand Maester Pycelle next, asking carefully about maladies of the mind if not the body. But he should have known the Grand Maester would be too sycophantic and afraid to ever entertain the possibility that the king might not be doing well out loud. Who could he turn to for this? Eddard might have helped. Gods, but Jon had hoped the Lord of Winterfell would answer the call this time. Perhaps sharing the battlefield with his old friend might have stirred something in Robert, might have brought him back to himself. But it was not to be. It occurred to Jon, not for the first time, that perhaps Eddard was suffering just as much as the king. "And Varys?" Robert asked. His tone shifted, sharpening just slightly. "What did he say?" Jon sucked in a breath through his teeth. Before the Raven had come from Casterly Rock telling of the sacking of Lannisport, the recent whispers from the east, rumors of Targaryen sails spotted near Volantis, had been the only thing that seemed to lift Robert from his slump. For a few brief weeks, the king had shown something like his old fire. He'd paced the council chamber, demanding reports, ordering searches. Jon only wished he could fan those flames. If only to see the man come to life again. But he could not lie. Could not give false hope to his king. Not when such a lie could bring so much instability to the kingdoms. He shook his head. "Nothing, Your Grace." "And you believe him?" Jon let out a soft snort. "I would not trust the eunuch to roll down the giant's lance if I pushed him down myself." He paused, meeting Robert's eyes. "But he is competent in his craft. I have my own men around the kingdoms and beyond. Men I've worked with for decades. He spread his hands. If there are any Targaryens out there, they are ghosts, Robert. The Seven Kingdoms and its king cannot chase ghosts forever. Ghosts? Robert repeated. He looked away, his gaze drifting to the window. Velaryon and his fleet gone before Stannis even set sight on Dragonstone. 3 Kingsguard vanished without a trace. Elia Martell and her sprogs out there somewhere, plotting against my reign. He shook his head. Ghosts indeed. Jon felt a headache forming at the back of his skull, a dull throb that promised to worsen as the day wore on. How many times must they have this conversation? He did not like to rebuke Robert too harshly on this subject. These so-called mysteries had been the only thing the king ever took a real interest in during his reign. The only time his eyes lost that glassy, distant look. And it was true they did not have solid answers. But the truth often came from the simplest explanations, not grand conspiracies. Velaryon had likely wrecked his fleet in the storm that swept across the narrow sea before Lord Stannis could take Dragonstone. Sir Gerald Hightower and his 2 fellow Kingsguard were either long dead or living as penniless exiles in Essos, their white cloaks sold for bread. Such famed knights as the White Bull and the Sword of the Morning would not have gone unnoticed by his contacts for long, not even if they went as far east as Asai. And Elia Martell and her poor children? They were rotting at the bottom of Blackwater Bay, if the rumors were true that she'd thrown herself from a balcony when Tywin Lannister sacked the city. There's something else, Jon said, hoping to change the subject. Even though he knew this would be no more pleasant for Robert. It's the Queen. Robert's head turned slowly. What now? His shoulders tightened like a man expecting a blow. She has decided to accompany you to Casterly Rock. Jon kept his tone neutral. She says she wishes to give alms and show her support for the small folk of Lannisport after the sacking. For a moment, Robert only stared at him. Then he let out a sudden cackle that echoed off the stone walls. He kept laughing, bending forward and clutching his belly as if it hurt, until he sounded almost manic and deranged. Somehow, Jon found himself chuckling along. Then laughing outright. Within moments the 2 of them were doubled over, gasping, giggling like squires who'd snuck wine from the kitchens. When it finally subsided, Robert looked up at him with a crooked smile on his face. Jon felt a pang of sorrow stab through his chest. For just a moment, it almost looked like the old Robert. The boy who'd fostered at the Eyrie, who'd swung a warmer like it weighed nothing, who'd laughed freely and loved fiercely. "Thank you for this parting gift, Jon," Robert said. He walked over to his bed and grabbed the wineskin. "I'll remember it when I feel like throwing myself off my horse." He took a long swig, then wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. "My lovely wife will be joining us on the road, eh? Gods, but that is the cruelest thing you've ever told me." Later, Jon stood in the yard of the Red Keep and watched as the king mounted his horse. The retinue formed up around him, knights in polished armor, bannermen carrying standards that snapped in the wind, servants leading pack animals and wagons laden with supplies. Behind them all, moving at a ponderous pace, came the slow-rolling carriage carrying Queen Cersei Lannister. Robert did not look back. Just spurred his horse forward and rode through the gates. Accompanying him on the Gold Road would be the levies of the Crownlands, which would be joined by some of Lord Hoster's men midway to Casterly Rock. A respectable force. Along with the men under Tywin, the Reachmen and the Northmen, it would be more than enough to crush the Ironborn in their foolhardy rebellion. Jon watched until the last of the column disappeared from view, swallowed by the streets of King's Landing. Then he turned back toward the Tower of the Hand. The king leaving would not affect much of his own duties. He already did most of the ruling of the kingdom himself, had done so for years now. He was a king without a crown, in truth. And seeing what the weight of that crown was doing to the boy whose brow it sat upon, a boy Jon loved like his own son, he only wished, like any father would, that he could bear it all for him. And, we see a few more glimpses into the O part of the story. Chapter 13. Galad. The beach had become a vast encampment, thousands of men and supplies crowding the sand and the rocky ground beyond it. Tents stretched in crooked rows up toward the cliffs. Cook fires sent thin columns of smoke into the grey sky. Horses stamped and whinnied in makeshift corrals. Somewhere, a smith's hammer rang against an anvil in steady rhythm. Most of the men who had fallen in the initial taking of the beach were buried in a long ditch dug beneath the cliffs. A Septon had spoken over them earlier, his voice carrying across the beach as the wind tugged at his robes. He spoke of the mercy of the mother, the judgment of the father, the love of the maiden, the wisdom of the crone, the pride of the warrior. The men had stood with heads bowed. Some prayed. Others simply stared at the ground. Now, after the final boats approached the beach carrying the high lords and men of stature, Galad stood on a hillside near where they had held against the Ironborn charge. 2 graves lay side by side there, the recently dug earth darker than the fields of rock and grass around them. As a knight, Lorne would have likely warranted a separate grave either way. And as a friend, it was the least Galad could do. He had dug it himself, along with Neril and a few other men-at-arms from Highgarden who had known Lorne. The work had been hard, the ground rocky and stubborn. His hands were raw by the time they finished, blisters forming across his palms. He had not minded. Before they began, Mors had asked for his brother to be buried beside Lorne. Galad had seen no reason to deny it. It had shamed me that Micah and I did not share a father between us, Mors said. The men turned to him. The boy had not spoken much as they dug the graves, just worked in silence, his face pale and drawn. Now, as they threw the last shovelfuls of earth atop them, he raised his voice. Mors shook his head. Proper fool I was. We had one-sides us all along. Taught us how to hold a sword and how to swing it, how to ride a horse and how to get up when you fell from it. His voice cracked slightly. What else could a boy ask of a father? Galad tilted his head slightly, the words stirring old, calcified hurts he usually kept buried deep within the oneness. He had been 14 when Galad Damodred died, but the man had been a stranger to him, a cold figure of ambition who had never truly been a father to Galad or his siblings. He found he had grieved less for the man who sired him than he had for Gareth Brine. Here, lad, Neril said. Reaching for his side, he pulled out a waterskin, unstoppered it, and took a swig. He winced slightly. To Lorne. He passed the skin to Mors. The boy took a deep pull and almost choked, his eyes watering. Neril chuckled. Strong wine. Burns the grief out, if you let it. The others laughed, the sound cutting through the somber air. The skin was passed around, each man taking a swig in turn. When it reached Galad, he drank and recited a short prayer in his mind. For all the men who fell here. For young Micah. For Lorne. And for his fathers, both by blood and by deed, who had died in battles long ago in half-forgotten worlds. The crunch of boots on gravel sounded behind him. When he turned, it was to find the young knight who had stood beside them against the horses. Sir Aerys Oakhart, Neril had called him, a highborn son of a powerful house, though one Galad had heard did not send any levies to be a part of the Reach's host. Sir Aerys looked at the graves solemnly. He had helped them carry Lorne's broken body up the slope before the heralds had summoned him away. Sir Galad, the young man said, inclining his head. Sir Aerys. Lord Mace has summoned the lords and knights for a war council. Sir Aerys paused, his expression uncertain. I thought you would wish to join. Galad felt a familiar instinct rise, an excuse to abstain already forming on his tongue. He had no hunger for the company of high lords, nor any desire to dictate the grand movements of maps and pins. He had wanted a simple war. A soldier's war. He wanted to march, to eat, and to strike against men who behaved as dark friends. But the memory of the morning's chaos sat heavy in his mind. The lack of coordination, the absence of scouts, the sheer, arrogant negligence that had cost Micah and Lorne and dozens of other men. It staggered him. He could not take the responsibility of those lives upon his soul, nor did he want the burden of command he had carried for a lifetime in another world. Yet, how many more would die if he remained silent? I do not need to lead, he told himself, but perhaps he could nudge. He could highlight the deficiencies and hint at the tactics they so clearly lacked. He nodded, more to himself than to the young Oakhart. Lead the way, Sir. XXX. The command tent was a monstrosity of bright green and gold silk, a cavernous space that smelled of expensive wax and sweat. Inside, more than a dozen knights crowded around a massive oak table where heavy vellum maps were pinned down by silver paperweights shaped like roses. Galad stood at the rear, his height allowing him to look over a few pauldrons. He remained silent, observing the figurines on the map. Lord Mace had brought no great bannermen to Harlaw, only the knightly houses sworn to Highgarden and his own household knights and men-at-arms. It was a transparent display of strength, a way to prove that House Tyrell was a power in its own right, independent of the overmighty lords who served them. Though Galad understood the reasoning behind it, it felt like a dangerous vanity to indulge in the middle of a campaign. Enough, sirs. Mace Tyrell's booming voice cut through the bickering. Enough. I will have my stalwart knights act not as unruly children, but as the flower of chivalry I know you to be. The murmurs died down. The men stood taller, preening. All around the tent, beside his own scuffed armor and Sir Ares's, the other knight's plate gleamed, polished to a shine. Not a scuff or dent to be seen among them. None had fought in the taking of the beach. Even Sir Willem, who commanded the landings, had not a mark against his plate. Galad did not let personal feelings rankle him. Leading from the rear was a sound choice for maintaining an army's command chain and coherence, if not morale. Mace Tyrell gathered a few flower figurines in hand. As the Reach has done to the islands we were tasked to quell, House Tyrell will further divide our forces here. He smiled broadly. Speed, sirs. That shall be our key to success. Nods of agreement followed. Excited cheers. Galad frowned. He did not like where this was going. We will march out of here in 5 different armies, one for each keep House Harlaw controls on this isle. Mace pointed to spots on the map. Their Bannermen rule 4 other seats, but these tend to be smaller wooden keeps, likely to be abandoned for more fortified strongholds. Unless they threaten our supply lines, bypass them and head to the main castles. We shall take them all in a fortnight. Cries of "I" and Tyrell filled the air. One knight called out, "Who shall lead the columns, my lord?" A ripple of excitement spread through the knights. Men jostled for position, as if being in front of the lord would give them better claim for such an office. Yes, yes, Lord Mace said, smiling. He seemed to enjoy the attention. You need not fight amongst yourselves. My decision has been made. A hush settled over the group. Mace put down the first flower figurine over a spot on the map. Sir Igan shall take Harridan Hill. A burly man banged his gauntlet against his chest piece. The captain of Highgarden's guard. More figurines were placed as he named the commanders, each followed by a small cheer from the named commander and his followers. Sir Owen Inchfield will go to Harlaw Hall. Sir Vortimer Crane will fall upon the Tower of Glimmering. Sir Willem Withers will command the host attacking Grey Garden. Mace paused, then placed the final figurine. And I will personally lead the main thrust against 10 Towers and Roderick Harlaw himself. Another round of whooping followed. Galad's frown had only deepened. Dividing an army for speed was sound strategy if speed was needed, but this could not be further from the situation they were in. He was walking forward before he knew he was doing it, bumping past several knights who grumbled at the intrusion of a mud-stained woodsman. He did not stop until he stood directly across the table from the Lord of Highgarden. "A word, if I may, my lord," Galad said, loud enough to be heard over the cheering. Lord Mace's eyes settled on him for a long moment before they lit up with recognition. "Ah, the hero of Dustinbury." He spread his arms wide as if to embrace him. The men closest turned to look. "Come, Sir Galad, come. I have not seen you since the battle in the inn. Where have you been hiding, my good man?" Galad bowed with practiced formality. "I was helping with the reconstruction in the village before joining your host, my lord." "Of course you were." Mace's smile broadened. "If what my daughter says is true, you are as good a woodsman as you are a knight. Noble work, helping those poor folks, and let it not be said House Tyrell did not contribute, et." Galad nodded. It was true. None in the village had spent a penny on reconstruction. "Right, tell me then. What is it, Sir Galad?" "It is about the division of our forces," Galad said, his voice level. "I do not question the boldness of the strategy, my lord. Only its necessity." The joviality in the tent curdled. Mace's smile didn't vanish, but it became a fixed, brittle thing. He gestured for Galad to continue. Approaching the table, Galad carried on. "The Royal and Redwine fleets control the seas and the flow of supplies all across the Iron Islands." He ran his hand across the sea lanes on a secondary map. "The Harlaws have nowhere to run to. No reinforcements coming to save them. No more food beyond what they have in their stores. And so we strike while they are weak," Mace said, his tone still genial but edged with impatience. "Speed, Sir Galad. We take their keeps before they can hole up and force long sieges. We already outnumber the forces on this island, my lord," Galad said carefully. "But House Harlaw knows the terrain better than we do. They know the passes, the bogs, where to ambush us, just as they did in the battle to take the beach." He gestured to the map. "Dividing our army will only weaken us unnecessarily. 5 supply lines instead of 1. 5 columns vulnerable to raids and ambushes instead of a single, concentrated force. The Ironborn are broken, Sir Owen Inchfield said, eyes narrowed at him. They scattered like rats when we landed. You would have us crawl across this island like old women afraid of shadows. A few knights chuckled. Galad kept his voice level. Their infantry fled with few losses, Sir, though I understand you were not there to see it. Even if they scattered, that does not mean they will not regroup. That they will not strike at our flanks when we are spread thin. Then we crush them when they do, Sir Vortimer Crane said. He was younger, eager. Better to force them into battle than let them hide behind walls. It is also likely, Galad continued, that once Pike and House Greyjoy dip their banners, House Harlaw will do the same. Roderick Harlaw is said to be a sensible, clever man. He will not fight to the bitter end once his liege lord has capitulated. There is no need to bleed our men in 5 separate bogs for a victory that is already inevitable. Mace Tyrell's smile thinned. You would have us sit idle, then? Wait for word from Pike while the other kingdoms take their islands and we accomplish nothing. I would have us take this island methodically, my lord, Galad said. One keep at a time, with our full strength. Minimize our losses and ensure victory. Minimize our losses, Sir Willem Withers repeated. He was older, grey-haired, his face weathered. Tell me, Sir, how many battles have you commanded? Galad hesitated. Too many, he wanted to say, but the knight seemed to take his silence for fear. Withers stepped closer, his expression hard. You speak like a boy too afraid to leave his mother's skirts. War is not won by caution. It is won by bold action. Bold action without thought is recklessness, Galad said. His jaw tightened. And recklessness costs lives. Or perhaps, Sir Owen Inchfield said, his voice dripping with disdain, you simply lack the stomach for it. You are a woodsman, after all. It is not in your nature to think as a knight. A ripple of laughter spread through the tent. Galad felt heat rise in his chest. I only seek to counsel. And we have heard your counsel, Sir Galad, Mace Tyrell said, his tone final. But I will not have it said that House Tyrell lagged behind while the other kingdoms won glory. The plan stands. He looked around the tent, his voice rising. We march at first light in the morrow. 5 armies. 5 victories. The Reach will show the realm what true strength looks like. The knights cheered. Swords were raised. Galad stood still, his hands clenched at his sides. Mace turned back to him, his expression softening slightly. You are a good man, Sir Galad. A brave one. But leave strategy to those who have studied it their whole lives, yes. It was a clear and firm dismissal. Galad bowed his head. As you say, my lord. He stepped back from the table, moving through the crowd until he reached the edge of the tent. Outside, the air was cool and damp. The clouds had thickened overhead, promising rain. Galad stood for a moment, breathing slowly, forcing the into the flame until he floated in the cold of the void. He could not follow such men for long, he thought, and the decision came easily to him. He could not serve a lord who treated the lives of his soldiers like coins to be spent on his own reputation. Once this war was over, he would leave. He would renounce his position as a Tyrell knight, even if it meant breaking the promise he had made to young Garland. He would not be a part of this folly a second time. Chapter 14. They set off early the next morning. Galad walked beside the men, part of the column led by Sir Willem Withers. The army snaked through the hills, heading northeast toward Grey Garden, a castle that sat on the northeastern tip of the island of Harlaw. Without a proper port, they had brought few horses to land. Galad had left his own warhorse stabled in Highgarden. For now, only Lord Mace, the commanders of the armies, and a few of the richer knights rode instead of walked. The rest trudged on foot, armor clinking with each step, boots scraping against rock and dirt. The strategy, if it could be called that, relied entirely on Sir Owen Inchfield seizing the port at Harlaw Hall, about a day's march east, to establish a lifeline. Lord Mace had avoided landing by 10 Towers and its port town precisely because of how much Lord Roderick Harlaw had reinforced it. Until then, each column of 1,000 men depended on 10 pairs of mules pulling small wagons and what they could carry on their own backs. Another absurdity, in Galad's mind. Provisioning an army should be a commander's first concern before any thought of battles, much less of victory. Should Sir Owen fail to take the port town by Harlaw Hall, their campaign would be doomed before it could even start. 6 hours into their march, the first attack came. They had been moving through a curving pass between two rocky hills when a trumpet blasted twice from the vanguard. Cries of Ironborn rippled back through the line, but by the time Galad's company reached the river ford, the fighting was done. 24 reachmen lay in the mud, their blood clouding the water of the river. The Ironborn had vanished, leaving only a handful of their own dead and a mess of hoof prints heading north into the high country. Sir Willem doubled the scouts after that and tripled the men protecting their small baggage train, but the land was a maze of crags and gorse. By nightfall, 2 scouting parties had vanished into the mist. The lone survivor told a tale that chilled the campfire less dark, cavalry, appearing from the very stones, striking with the suddenness of a mountain storm. Fearing a nighttime raid that never came, they slept poorly that night. Ate little in the morning. Were marching again before the sun fully rose. The mood in the army was somber after the first day's harsh welcome to Harlaw, but the lack of further attacks throughout the daylight hours gave the men some hope that those had been lucky breaks for the Ironmen. It was on that second night that the Ironborn truly struck. This time, they had not found a village to settle in for the day. Instead, a farmhouse served as the center of their camp. The Ironborn seemed determined to deter their advance by any means. Everywhere they had passed through was a burned husk, and the farm, mostly, was no different. The barn had been torched. The chicken coop was a charred skeleton. The pigsty a blackened ruin. Only the house itself stood intact, which Sir Willem was quick to commandeer it for himself and his knights. The Ironborn must have taken all the animals with them, and killed the ones they could not move. A cow with a broken leg was found in a puddle of dark, congealed blood in the fields, flies swarming thick around the corpse. Later, the first 3 men to drink water from the well were squatting by the bushes even now, groaning and clutching their bellies. The 4th had been observant enough to notice the dead pig wedged inside the well, bloated and rotting. They would have to contend with the water they had gotten from the stream they had passed through earlier. As one of the knights under Sir Willem, though certainly one without favour, Galad had been given command of the first watch. He set the sentries in staggered rings around the farmhouse and the fields where the men were camped. No campfires were to be lit, so as not to impair their own vision. He had even ordered men into the stubby, wind-bent trees, telling them to watch the camp's interior as much as the dark horizon. In the end, none of it mattered. He had just handed over the watch to one of Sir Willem's veterans and slipped into a shallow sleep when he woke to screams. He stumbled out of his tent with only his pants on and his sword at his side. The oneness came to him almost by instinct, that quiet clarity settling over his mind like a veil. Around him, the camp erupted in chaos, but he could look at it with a clinical eye. Riders galloped through the edges of the camp in small groups, cutting down men where they stood, still dazed from sleep. Others rode past throwing lit torches into tents and pavilions. The blazes caught quickly, flames leaping high, lighting up the night. Riders swept through the edges of the camp, their torches arcing through the air like falling stars. Tents erupted into blossoms of fire, silhouetting men as they were cut down in their bedrolls. He saw it all in 2 heartbeats, and then his eyes were moving to the center of the camp, the supply wagons. The guards there had abandoned their posts, drawn toward the fires at the perimeter like moths to a flame. He could imagine the eager sentries leaving their posts to fight against the riders. An understandable mistake, but a costly one if the Ironborn managed to reach the supplies. Men ran all around him. Some screamed. Others moved like rats in a flood, confused and panicked. Some still hid in their tents despite being awake. No one rallied them. No one. Galad grabbed the next 2 men that ran past him. "You 2 are with me," he said, and in the cold of the void, the edge in his voice made them obey quickly enough. He moved through the chaos, gathering more men as he went. Some recognized him and fell in without question. Others he had to grab by the arm and point toward the supply wagons. Within moments, he had a group of 15, maybe 20, all armed but most only half-dressed. "With me!" he shouted, and ran toward the center of the camp. The wagons came into view, dark shapes against the firelight. They were untouched. And as Galad arrived, breathing hard, sword ready, they remained untouched. None of the riders approached. He frowned, scanning the darkness beyond the ring of tents. The attacks continued at the edges of the camp, but here, at the center, nothing. The riders circled like wolves, hooting and jeering, but did not close in. Why? Then, across the field, the farmhouse suddenly erupted in flames. The blaze was massive, all-consuming. Fire poured from the windows and doorway, climbing the walls so fast it seemed impossible. Galad almost thought an Aes Sedai had set it afire with one of their weaves, so quickly did the flames take hold. Men screamed inside. He could hear them even from here, desperate wails as the fire consumed them. "Seven hells," one of the men beside him breathed. Galad stared at the inferno, his mind working through it. The attacks at the edges. The lack of riders near the supplies. The farmhouse going up like kindling. A distraction. The realization settled cold in his gut. By the time the sun rose and they spoke to the few surviving men who had escaped the farmhouse, Galad's suspicions were confirmed. The attacks at the edge of the camp had been a diversion all along. A group of Ironborn had been hiding inside the house's concealed cellar the entire time. As the Reachmen slept, they came up from below and slaughtered the men inside. Quietly at first. Throats cut. Skulls caved in with hammers. When Sir Willem had finally woken and fought back, managing to lock himself and a small group of knights inside a room, the Ironborn had simply locked the doors from the outside and set the house aflame. None of the men had stopped them as they left the camp. Not in the chaos. Not as the Ironborn wore the colors and the blood of the Reachmen. Looking at the remains of the farmhouse, Galad stood in the grey morning light, the men who had followed him to the wagons beside him. He was thankful when he saw Moors coming up, Neril at his side. He had not seen them throughout the night, but at least they had survived. They stopped near him, silent as graves. In a way, that's what the farmhouse was. Smoke still rose from the wreckage. The smell of burned flesh and timber hung thick in the air. Sir Willem Withers was dead. Along with a dozen of his best knights. And the Ironborn had vanished into the hills like ghosts. Chapter 15. Hilmer Pike. After 4 days of grey drizzle that turned the hillside paths to sucking mud and soaked through every layer of wool and leather a man owned, the sky had broken open and the light was sharp and clean across the valley below. Hilmer Pike tilted his face up toward it for a moment, feeling the warmth on his cheeks, and thought that this was a fine day to become a warrior. He shifted in the saddle and immediately regretted it. The horse flicked an ear back at him as if it could feel his discomfort and found it irritating. Hilmer had named the animal Crockenfist in his head, because it sounded strong, but in truth the horse was a bad-tempered grey gelding that smelled like wet rope and seemed to regard him with something close to contempt. He could not decide which was worse, the animal's rolling gait or the hard wooden seat beneath him. His father's fishing boat had pitched and rolled in ways that would have put any landlubber on his knees, and Hilmer had never once lost his footing. Yet somehow this creature managed to find every stone and rut on Harlaw's rocky ground and hit them all directly. Still. A horse was a horse, and men on horses killed men on foot. That was the point of it. Around him the others waited in the shadow of the ridge, 24 riders with their mail hanging quiet and the horses stamping softly in place. Maron Myers sat at the front of the group, a compact, weathered man who said little but who held the ear of Sir Harris. Further down the line, Gundar Half-Eye sat with his one good eye fixed on the crest of the ridge where the scout had gone up. Hilmer had been the one to spot the column. That mattered. He had gone out from camp hours before dawn, ordered to look out for any force approaching them from the south. More to get a good view of the sun rising than anything, he had climbed the ridge in the early grey light, and there they were, men and wagons coming up north, small as beetles in the distance, heading toward the valley floor below. He had scrambled back to camp so fast he'd torn his knee open on a rock and not even noticed until he was already talking. Sir Harris had not been there to hear it. Off harassing the landings by Harlaw Hall with most of the cavalry. But Maron had listened, and Maron had nodded, and now here they were. Last night, they had left him behind for the farmhouse raid. He was a runner, he knew, pressed into service and not meant for fighting like this. Too young, they said, too green. He had argued and been ignored. But this was different. He had brought the information himself. He had climbed the ridge himself. They could not cut him out of this one. Let them try, he thought, righteous anger burning at his chest. Footsteps came down the rocky slope, and the scout appeared from behind a shelf of stone, dressed in grey leathers the same color as the hillside. "They're coming," the scout panted, looking up at Maron. Just like the boy said. Someone leaned over from the next horse and slapped Hilmer hard across the shoulders. He sat up straighter, spine stiffening, trying to look like the warrior he felt he was becoming. No more stupid errands around the village. No more gutting fish. No more tying nets. "How many?" Maron asked. 4 wagons, no more than 20 men walking beside them. The scout scratched at his chin. "Ragged lot. The wounded from last night, I'd say." Saw some knights in the wagons. Dead, methinks. Marron grunted. Aye. Heading west to their flower lord at 10 Towers. Sir Harris said the boys killed the lordlings in the farmhouse. Important men. Men whose families will want a body to bury in the green grass. ASOIAF came from the back of the group. Not much to loot from dead and dying men, Vicken muttered, spitting into the dirt. Aye, another Iron Man added, casting a sidelong glance at Hilmer. Thought the boy had found us a supply column. I've a hunger for something other than dried fish and rain. Hilmer felt his face flush with heat. He shot a burning glare at Vicken, but the older man merely shrugged, unimpressed by his posturing. We're here to kill Reachman, Marron said, his voice flat and final. Don't matter if they've got gold and food up their bums or nothing but rotting linen on their backs. We kill them anyway. Kill enough of them, mayhaps they start thinking Harlaw isn't worth that much blood. Gundar Half-Eye made a low sound of agreement from down the line. The veteran had a face like a piece of dried saltfish and had been raiding since before Hilmer was born. Only place in the islands where they haven't had it easy, he said. Not a bad thing to be remembered for. The men nodded, a grim pride settling over the company. Hilmer felt his chest swell. The only ones to stand. It was a fine thought. He could see it. Songs about the men of Harlaw, the last house to bend. His name in them, maybe. Hilmer Pike, who spotted the column and rode with Marron Myers and Gundar Half-Eye. They didn't sing songs about fishermen. He had thought about that as the scout climbed back up the ridge, and thought about it still when the man came sliding back down 5 minutes later and swung up into his saddle without a word. Marron raised his hand and moved forward, and they all moved with him. XXX. The pass was narrow enough that the horses had to go single file, their hooves muffled by the strips of cloth wrapped around them. The walls of rock rose close on either side, the shadow between them cool after the open sun. Hilmer watched the back of Mayron's horse ahead of him and listened to the creak of leather and the occasional soft clink of a mail ring. No one spoke. The pass bent north and then widened gradually, the walls pulling back, and Hilmer could see daylight opening ahead where the valley spread out below. Marron raised his hand again, and the column split, half behind him, half peeling away behind Gundar to circle down toward the far end of the column. They picked up speed. The trot became a canter and the canter built toward a gallop, and the valley opened fully in front of him, wide and bright in the noon sun, and there was the column below, just as the scout had described. They were a sorry sight, 4 wagons moving in a loose line along the valley floor, men limping alongside them, heads down, bandages showing white against dark clothing. Some used their spears as walking sticks. One man near the front had his arm in a rough sling, his head wrapped in cloth stained rust brown. Beaten men. Broken men. Heading home to lick their wounds. Someone in the column looked up. A shout went out. Heads turned, hands pointed, and the column ground to a halt in confusion, men clutching at weapons, a few trying to cluster together in loose groups that would not have slowed a charge much more than open air would. The wind hit Hilmer's face as the gallop took hold, his horse's hooves drumming on the valley floor, and he felt something lift free in his chest, something that had been coiled tight for weeks. This. The ground blurring past. The distance closing. The men ahead getting larger. His hand found the haft of his axe. His first real battle. It would make it all worth it. For the Reaper. Marron bellowed. The men answered with more cries. Hilmer was grinning. He could feel it on his face and couldn't help it and didn't want to. He wanted to kill someone. Needed to kill someone. The tarps on the wagons flew back. He had a single moment of confusion, of thinking the corpses were moving, before his mind caught up with what his eyes were seeing. The bodies in the wagons were rising. Not dead men. Men who had been lying still, men in armor, unfolding themselves from the wagon beds with spears already in hand, dropping over the sides and forming up in tight lines on the valley floor. Others stayed in the wagon beds. They already had bows drawn. The first volley came before Hilmer had fully understood what was happening. The man to his left went down, horse and rider together. Another rider ahead of him pitched sideways from his saddle with an arrow through his neck, his horse veering wild. Marron bellowed something, but the second volley was already in the air, and then the men on the ground released what Hilmer had taken for spears, and they weren't spears at all. They flew. Javelins. The Reachman threw javelins. One buried itself in the chest of Mayron's horse and the animal screamed and went down so suddenly that Marron barely cleared the stirrups, and then Marron hit the ground so hard it sounded like a woodsman splitting logs, and he did not get up. Break! Break away! Someone was screaming. Hilmer yanked the reins. His horse needed no convincing, already trying to veer off, whites showing around its eyes. An arrow hissed past his ear, so close he felt the air of it. Another struck the earth a yard to his left. He bent low over the horse's neck and rode, not daring to look behind him, just riding, the animal's panic matching his own perfectly. 2 other riders were with him, he could hear them besides him. They swept past the front of the column, too fast for the archers to track properly, arrows falling short or wide. The end of the valley was ahead. Open ground. The hills pulling back. He could see the pass that led west and safety, and he rode straight for it. I'm out, Hilmer thought, a sob of relief rising in his throat. I'm safe. The horse stumbled. It happened without warning. One moment the ground was solid and the next the world turned sideways. Hilmer had no time to do anything useful. He left the saddle at speed, hit the rocky ground shoulder first, rolled hard, and came to a stop with his face against the earth and his ears full of a sound like the inside of a bell. He lay still. The bell faded slowly. He could hear voices. He tried to push himself up and his arms did not work properly. He tried again, got his cheek off the dirt, and managed to turn his head. Boots on rock. Several pairs, coming toward him from the hillside above. He blinked at them, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. Men coming out from cracks and shelves in the hillside, from behind boulders, from under overhangs. They had been there the whole time. He thought, with distant clarity, that he should try to stand. He needed to prove his father wrong. Warriors died on their feet, no? His legs did not respond to the thought. Strong hands took him under the arms. The sky swung overhead. Someone said something in the soft, rounded accent of the Reach, and another voice answered, and then he was being carried, and the darkness at the edges of his vision thickened and closed. XXX. Light. The smell of canvas and blood and unwashed men. Hilmer blinked. He was lying on his back in a wagon, the tarp pulled over the ribs of the wagon frame arching above. His shoulder was fire. His head felt stuffed with wet wool. On either side of him, other bodies lay still. Ironmen, he thought, though he couldn't be certain. One of them was breathing in short, shallow pulls. Through the opening at the wagon's rear, the valley light came in bright and white. A shadow crossed it. Then a man stepped in front of the opening and blocked the sun. Hilmer squinted up at him. Dark hair. Tall. A face that gave nothing away, hard as the stones in the valley. And eyes that caught the light wrong, pale and violet, the color of deep water or a storm cloud as the sunset or something Hilmer had no good word for. The man looked at him for a moment, unhurried. Then he turned his head and said to someone outside, him. Hands took Hilmer by the arms and dragged him out of the wagon to the ground, and the pain in his shoulder made him bite down on the inside of his cheek until he tasted iron. The violet-eyed man crouched in front of him, elbows on his knees, and waited until Hilmer's vision steadied. How many men do you have at Grey Garden? He asked. His voice was even. No heat in it. Not a hint of a threat. Just a question asked by someone who fully expected it to be answered. Hilmer meant to say nothing. He had a vague idea of himself staying silent, jaw-locked, staring the Greenlander down. A proper iron-born warrior, giving nothing away. But his head was ringing, and Maron was dead, and the ambush had turned him inside out in about 30 seconds, and when the man asked again, the same way, same tone, patient as tide, Hilmer found his mouth opening before he had decided to let it. He told him what he knew, which wasn't much. Told him about the camp an hour's ride north. About the passes Sir Harris used. About the garrison at the castle and how they'd stripped all the land for food, his village included, and how they'd killed his father when he refused to give his fish, his foolish, weak father who never wanted his son to be a warrior. He told him all of it. Until something loosened in his chest and his eyes stung with hot, angry tears. The violet-eyed man listened without interrupting, nodding occasionally, and when Hilmer finally stopped talking he looked at him for a moment longer. Thank you, he said, which was not at all what Hilmer had expected. Then he stood and walked away, and Hilmer sat in the wagon in the bright noon sun and felt, for the first time since his father died, very much like a fisherman's son.
Additionally, if you would like to request novels and access my Google Drive where I have 200+ audiobooks, then you can join my Patreon. Link is also provided in the description.